Chapter 422. With the old geezer keeping an eye on everything happening in the southern hemisphere for him, Sulu knew even before the Federation HQ did. At the weak point of the Iron Curtain dividing line between the north and the south, the Imperial Assault Group with nearly 20,000 soldiers was moving at high speed towards them. Although he already knew that it was the Iron 7 Division who carried out the ambush mission in the valley, and although he and the Iron 7 Division had a complicated, insignificant, and vexing relationship, and this kind of relationship even sometimes hid a kind of hostility between life and death, he still could not watch the Iron 7 Division be besieged by the Imperial Expeditionary Army, because those young soldiers were his fellow countrymen, young men just like him. The powerful electronic interference that covered dozens of square kilometers made it impossible for him to contact the officers of the Iron 7th Division through the battlefield command system. But when he thought that the HQ should have notified Du Shaoqing, Sulu relaxed a little. But he didn't know that the Iron 7th Division had more than 20 MXs in the valley, so he was very worried. These worries turned into a ball of fire. Following the hesitant but encouraging words of the young girl beside him, the invisible fire spewed out from the back of the Black MX and directly shot him back into the valley battlefield. With this chase, his Black MX chased all the way to the center of the battlefield. This was the area with the most terrifying firepower. Countless streaks of light flashed across the top of the mech's head. The smoke and sound of explosions enveloped the sky and earth. The bullets fired by the mountain howitzers were like violent men tearing apart the clothes of weak young girls, tearing apart the dark night sky with a sizzling sound. Of the 7 Imperial mechs that were chased back to the battlefield by the Black MX, one was destroyed on the way back, and the other 2 fled in fear. Only 4 were left. But Sulu didn't even have time to rest. The SCC monitoring system sent out an alarm. In the area where he was, 4 Imperial mechs were charging at him at high speed. 4 plus 4? How many mechs were there? This was not a problem in mathematics but rather a problem in the heart. Sulu made use of the little bit of bravery that had been stirred up on the battlefield tonight to charge back into the battlefield in silence. The Imperial Mecha, who had been fleeing in all directions under the powerful attacks of the MX fleet of Iron 7 Division, suddenly saw this Black MX with clearly different controls. It was as if the Imperial Mecha had sunk into despair, as if they were a pack of wounded wolves that had been chased to the edge of a cliff by a pride of lions, only to suddenly see a lion suddenly appear in their midst. If he could bite this lion to death, even if he died, it would be more pleasant and meaningful. Every Imperial Mecha pilot who saw this Black MX felt a fire ignite in their hearts. This sort of desperation before death and the strong psychological effect of suicidal thoughts caused the Empire's 3rd-generation mecha to suddenly unleash a powerful burst of power. Ignoring the serious damage they suffered, they forcibly broke away from the powerful attack range of the Iron 7th Division's MX mecha. They supported and covered each other as they moved to surround Suli's Black MX. There were no communications or orders. At the same time, many Imperial mecha also made this crazy choice. At this time, the battlefield command system of Iron 7th Division had temporarily been disabled. The Federation pilots operating the Black MX mecha obviously did not understand the intentions of the Imperial pilots. They were slightly stunned and could only watch as the Imperial mecha in front of them retreated without any regard for their lives, rushing down the valley. The Iron 7th Division pilots were very surprised. How could the Imperial pilots be so heroic in their escape? And where could they run to now? They did not know that the Imperial mecha were not running away, but were trying to drag down the person at the bottom before they died. And this person was Sulu. Don't blame the soldiers of the Imperial Moonwolf group for being so excited when they saw Suli's Black MX as if they had taken an aphrodisiac. It was just that his mecha piloting skills were too easy to recognize. This Black MX did not have any long-range firepower. It only relied on its insanely powerful mecha piloting skills to sweep through the wilderness. It was so eye-catching in the smoke of the night, so enchanting. It was the culprit who killed Captain Love and led the Moonwolf group into danger. After 4 mecha piloting, 4 more mecha piloting, and 4 more mecha piloting, as far as the field of vision could see, all the Imperial mecha piloting the Black MX did not need any orders. They rushed madly towards the Black MX at the bottom of the valley. Knowing that they were going to die, these Imperial pilots only had one thought left, and that was to drag this Black MX into the galaxy of death. On the screen, the Imperial mecha piloting the Black MX 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 mecha. Although there were not many of them, their momentum was extremely frightening. Su Li's face turned even paler. He did not have time to blame the Iron 7th Division's mecha battalion for their slow reaction speed. He already felt an unusually clear sense of danger. If he could reduce the pressure on the Iron 7th Division's mecha battalion, he believed that this mecha battle would end faster. Sulu rushed into the battlefield with this thought in mind, so he did not mind attracting the attention of 4 mecha, even if there were 8 third-generation Imperial mecha circling the valley at high speed. However, what was shocking was that he alone had attracted the attention of 16 Imperial mecha. Sulu and his Black MX were very strong, but he was definitely not stupid and naive enough to think that he was really fierce, violent, and invincible. Killing a 4th-generation Imperial mecha in one hit did not mean that he could ignore the siege of 16 third-generation Imperial mecha. Moreover, his piloting style was much more taxing on his body and mind compared to the average pilot. At this time he was already extremely tired. The most important thing was that although the MX was a machine, it was also worn out. CLK 84 points. CLS 17 seconds of overload. The emotionless alarm of the central control system rang out in the dull cockpit. These 2 data clouds were the most important comprehensive calculation values of a mecha. They were used to evaluate the overall operating condition of a mecha. The latter would usually break through the peak earlier than the former. If both were to break through the peak at the same time, then many of the MX mecha's components could be affected. The most obvious point was that the onboard ADS adaptive suspension system would inevitably enter an active state of wear and tear. The former had already exceeded 84 points, while the latter had exceeded the peak by 17 seconds. As one of the designers of the MX mecha, Sulu naturally knew how unstable the mecha's condition was now. However, this could not be blamed on the mecha. It should be known that at Cat Peak, Little White Flower was still able to hold on for so long after entering the overclocking state. It was just that tonight's battle situation was too tragic. The moment the Black MX entered the overclocking state, it began to continuously receive Su Li's high-speed commands. All 3 systems were in overload. The MX was really suffering under his piloting. If he didn't do that, he wouldn't be able to kill Love in one hit and chase after the 9 mechas of Empire. He wouldn't be able to do such a weird dance while being surrounded by 16 mechas of Empire. With a whoosh, the alloy blade at the front end of the Black MX's right mechanical arm slashed down fiercely, creating a deep gash on the left shoulder of one of the Imperial mecha. At the same time, the thick mechanical leg's hydraulic system suddenly compressed, shattering the rocks on the ground. The heavy body of the mecha drifted to the right like a fallen leaf, dodging the 3 high-speed cannon fire from behind. The Black MX's speed did not decrease at all. Like a shadow, it swept past the 2 Imperial mecha in front of it. The huge body of the mecha completed an unimaginable twisting movement in midair, dodging the attacks of the 2 Imperial mecha that had been charging up for a long time. However, another round of cannon fire came from the side. The Black MX could not turn around and destroy the 2 Imperial mecha at all. Every second, an Imperial mecha would fearlessly pounce on the Black MX. Gorgeous cannon fire would explode. Danger was constantly singing a heart-stopping ballad beside the Black MX. In just a few short seconds, another 2 Imperial mecha were stripped of their combat power by the Black MX's strange and trembling steps. However, at the same time, another 3 surviving Imperial mecha rushed over. In the stuffy cockpit, only the sound of Su Li's heavy breathing could be heard. Beside him, the girl's cheeks were flushed red. Nervously pursing her lips, she seemed to have forgotten to breathe. The pale-faced youth's hands quickly swept across the control stick and touchscreen. His movements were so fast that they seemed to have turned into a series of afterimages. In this moment of life and death, no one knew what kind of peak his hand speed had reached. Moreover, most of the orders were still transmitted through the simulated reality system. Even he did not know how he had passed these 10 seconds of trepidation. In that split second of time, he had completely relied on his innate battle instincts and his intimate understanding of the mecha to subconsciously operate the mecha. In front of the frenzied Imperial mecha, Sulu was still calm. However, his trembling body and hands had already gone crazy. The Black MX followed his precise orders and made one after another incredible, unimaginable evasive maneuvers. In the darkness of the valley, the Black MX was as swift as a ghost, as swift as a knife. If the pilots of the Imperial Moonwolf group were facing a situation where they were completely wiped out, or if it was because of the death of Captain Love, they had become obsessed with the Black MX as if they had taken an aphrodisiac of death. In the cockpit, Jian Shuier had already entered a state of absent-mindedness. Her thin military uniform and short skirt were soaked with sweat, and her slender and white thighs were smeared with light. The scent of a young girl on her body, to Su Lu, was similar to an aphrodisiac. Was this also related to the fact that he could continuously perform so many peak-level maneuvers? More than 10 seconds later, the valley battlefield gradually calmed down. Su Lu alone attracted almost 20 Imperial mecha. The pressure on the Iron 7th Division mecha was suddenly reduced. They ended the surrounding battles early and then silently and urgently rushed to the rescue at high speed. At this time, they had already appeared on the gentle slope. The gentle slopes that could be seen everywhere in the Yellow Mountain Ridge and the Lonely Mountain Ridge were actually trenches created by the flow of the planet once every 3,000 years. In this lonely trench, the last 12 surviving Imperial mecha stood alone. Right in the middle of them was the Black MX. The final desperate plan of the Imperial mecha to surround and kill the Black MX had finally come to nothing. The surviving pilots of the Moon Wolf Brigade looked at the Black Federation mecha in the middle and truly fell into despair. The self-destruct system of the mecha was an internal destruction system. At this time, even if these 10 Imperial mecha surrounded the Black MX and collectively self-destructed, they would not be able to destroy the Black MX. Chapter 423. Attitude decided everything. This was just a very sportsmanlike slogan used in sports competitions. Although sports competitions were known as wars in the era of peace compared to a real battlefield, it was just a game of house. On this bloodfire planet at the edge of the universe where bullets were always more powerful than logic, the only thing that could truly decide everything was power. More specifically, in tonight's ambush or assault in the southwestern part of the planet, what could decide everything was the performance of the mecha. Imperial Expeditionary Force, Maple Forest Alliance, Special Moonwolf Group. This was a very long list of names. The length of the name often represented its importance. These words could help to confirm that these Imperial mecha pilots were very good at controlling their mecha, definitely better than the Iron 7 Division's mecha battalion. At the very least, it was impossible for them to be weaker than them. However, more than 100 third-generation mecha from the Imperial Federation were defeated miserably in the face of more than 20 new mecha from the Federation. There was no way they could fight back at all. The sounds of battle and explosions around them completely stopped in a very short amount of time. Iron 7 Division quickly cleared the outer battlefield. In the entire mountainous area, only a dozen tattered Imperial mecha remained. They were heavily surrounded by Federation mecha groups and heavy firepower units. The usually strong and heavy black-green mecha were now so weak and tired. There was no way for them to break out of the encirclement. The war between the Federation and the Empire was a war of life and death that had been condensed for decades. The lives of tens of millions of people were used as bargaining chips. The pressure was so cold and hard that the hearts of both sides were as cold and hard as iron. In the eyes of the people of the Federation, the people of the Empire were wild beasts. In the eyes of the people of the Empire, the people of the Federation were hypocritical and cruel mutants. A deep trench had long been drawn between the two races that could never be filled up. After several decades, the encounter between the two neighbors had long since turned into a bloody race war that fought for the small space of survival in the vast universe. Humans would not surrender like pigs. This was a very simple principle, so the people of the Empire would not surrender to the Federation either. The 10 or so third-generation Moon Wolf mechas that were already at the end of their rope launched their final desperate and frenzied attacks amidst the ear-piercing sounds of grinding metal. This final attack was still aimed at Su Li's Black MX mech in the middle. Even further away, 20 or so Black MXs from the Federation charged forward at high speed from all sides of the gentle slope. This was a picture of a big ring within a small ring, but it didn't make people feel that it was ridiculous or funny. There was only the coldness and madness of death, and the desperation that was clearly transmitted to every speck of dust in the valley. Tragic was a phrase used to describe the final frenzy of the last mecha of the Empire. Loud metallic clangs rang out incessantly as explosions occurred one after another. More than 10 small green-gray mushroom clouds rose up from the gentle slope from time to time. Sulu slowly took off his helmet and quietly looked at the last first-generation Empire mecha that had fallen to the ground not too far away. He looked at the explosion in the cockpit of that mecha, and his mood was a little strange. He could understand why the soldiers of the Empire didn't want to surrender, but he couldn't imagine what kind of ideology this group of soldiers, who had spent more than 7 years to come to a foreign country, relied on to shamelessly invade the Federation without batting an eyelid, crazily slaughter the people of the Federation, and finally kill themselves in the end. Could it be that the people of the Empire were really born to be so cold-blooded and heartless, or could it be that the fanatical worship of the Emperor in the Imperial Society had turned countless people into lunatics? The last 10 or so Empire mecha had already lost their spirit. This last suicidal charge didn't cause too much damage to his Black MX. He used the fastest time to leave the battlefield. He didn't have the energy to help Iron 7 Division's mecha battalion anymore. He could only watch with his own eyes and think silently in his heart. In less than 3 minutes, Iron 7 Division had completely wiped out one of the Imperial Expeditionary Forces mecha battalions. The ultra-strong electronic interference finally stopped, and Du Xiaoqing's usual calm voice came through the MX mecha's comm system. "You've worked hard." Sulu was slightly taken aback but didn't say anything. His palm lightly pushed on the control stick, and the black mecha slowly turned around on the slope. He left the Iron 7 Division's mecha battalion that was cleaning up the battlefield and walked out of the valley silently and heavily. The 20 or so black mechas of Iron 7 Division were cleaning up the last of the battlefield. They were trying to find a living Empire soldier in one of the cockpits that had severely imploded, but they found that their efforts were in vain. Right at this moment, they noticed that the Black MX of the Federation, which had played the most important role in tonight's battle, was leaving. The 20 or so black mechas almost simultaneously stopped what they were doing. Accompanied by the muffled sound of motors and hydraulic pipes, they saluted the Black MX that was walking down the slope, and then silently watched it leave. Until now, most of the soldiers of Iron 7 Division still didn't know who was in the Black MX, but this didn't stop them from showing their respect to this mecha. There was still an entire regiment in the mountainous area. The heavy infantry and artillery soldiers all walked out of their positions and began preparing for the next battle while smiling as they watched the Black MX leave. There were also many people who watched the Black MX leave, such as the officers in the Southern Hemisphere Federation Command Center, who were extremely far away, were all stunned speechless. On a mountain peak somewhere, Du Xiaoqing also took off his sunglasses. He watched the Black MX's heavy and even somewhat clumsy footsteps on the holographic screen in silence. The real-time battle report from the central mainframe was already out. Suli's Black MX had one-shot one of the Empire's 4th-generation Moonwolf mecha, defeated 5 3rd-generation mecha, and caused 4 3rd-generation mecha to lose their ability to fight. This meant that he had single-handedly taken out 1/10 of the Moonwolf group's combat power. Du Xiaoqing's brows furrowed slightly. He abruptly thought of a certain young officer who should be on another planet right now. That young officer was also a lieutenant colonel like Su Lu. In the past 5 years, Madman Li's battle record book had recorded the destruction of more than 100 Empire mecha. This kind of battle record was without a doubt the most insane number in history. However, today in just 1 short hour, Su Li's mecha could spray out 6 stars. At this rate, perhaps it wasn't impossible to catch up to Madman Li. Of course, Li Feng had basically been carrying out special missions for the past 5 years, and his opponents were often the true masters of the Empire's Royal Special Mecha Battalion. This comparison wasn't fair. What really made Du Qing frown was not the shocking battle record of the Black MX controlled by Su Lu earlier, but the final scene where the Black MX had led the last of the Empire's mecha in circles in the mountains. In the final moments, the Black MX hadn't been able to defeat any more mecha. Instead, it had seemed rather pathetic and dangerous. However, under the relentless pursuit of the Empire's mecha, what the Black MX had done seemed simple, but the fact that it had been able to survive was already shocking. Du Xiaoqing's eyes were extremely sharp. He knew very well that if Su Lu had made the slightest mistake in his judgment, or if his operation had been just a fraction of a second slower, he would have been piled up like a pile of leaves by those crazed Empire mecha. Then, regardless of friend or foe, they would have gone all out to burn him. What are this person's nerves made of? To be able to remain as calm as a machine in this kind of situation, not making a single mistake, Du Shaoqing mused silently. Unlike the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who were watching the Black MX leave, although this iron-blooded division commander thanked Su Lu for his hard work, he didn't feel any gratitude in his heart. From his perspective, Su Lu was a soldier of the Federation. Tonight the army needed him. Since he had the ability, it was only natural that he should listen to orders. If it were him, Du Shaoqing, he would have made the same choice as Su Lu. Division Commander Du Shaoqing was a standard Federation soldier. Although he loathed Su Lu, he still abided by his duties as a soldier. He would never do anything shady on the battlefield. However, as he watched the Black MX gradually disappear into the night, a strange thought suddenly welled up in his mind. If one day Su Lu became an enemy of the Federation, if he was inside the mecha, how many people would I need to capture or kill him? A battalion or a regiment? Or the entire Iron 7th Division? At almost the same time, the invisible old thing on the surface of the planet and the Federation's command center told Su Lu through different channels that the road to Luoqiu spaceport was very safe. The main forces on the north-south dividing line were conducting a high-speed maneuver deployment. He and his Black MX could take a break. Su Lu was slightly startled. He took off the thin but heavy simulation system with great difficulty. Once his mind relaxed, even this small movement made him clearly feel the intense soreness in his muscle fiber bundles. This kind of soreness was an unbearable pain. He couldn't help but purse his lips tightly and let out a muffled groan. The accumulated sweat flowed down his naked body like water overflowing from a pool. It flowed out from the simulation system and wet the entire lower half of the cockpit. It added a lot of unpleasant smells to the stuffy cockpit. Luckily, the MX mecha was waterproof both inside and outside. Su Lu thought self-deprecatingly as he dragged the black box with difficulty and took out his clothes. He wiped his body carelessly and then hurriedly put them on. Just these few movements made him groan in pain several times in succession. An unhealthy blush appeared on his pale face. Su Lu took a few deep breaths. He felt sore, tired, and hungry. These adjectives were about to knock him down. However, Luoqiu spaceport was still very far away. From the pocket of his military uniform, Su Lu took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes that had long been crushed out of shape. With trembling fingers, he lit one up. He greedily inhaled deeply and then sprayed it into the sealed cockpit. Only then did he remember that the person he was supposed to protect, the nation's maiden, was still sitting beside him. Running for thousands of miles, mecha chasing and escaping, fighting in the valley, exploding to kill the enemy. Tonight's scenes had already caused Jian Shui'er's small face to turn pale. Especially the exquisite mecha piloting skills Su Lu had displayed. It made her eyes light up and she was mesmerized. Although the maiden was brave, she was after all not a man made of iron. She was a professional soldier who had been through a lot. Her body was already extremely weak. Right now she was clutching at her chest, feeling nauseous. Suddenly, she saw the red dot on the lips of the young man beside her. She subconsciously reached out her hand and after a slight stiffening, she carefully took it off. Her slender fingers were trembling uncontrollably. Her action of holding the cigarette was unfamiliar. In order to hide her panic, she took a deep breath and then coughed violently. Chapter 424. Hearing the coughing beside him, Su Lu was slightly startled. He took the cigarette from her hand and asked, "You haven't smoked before?" Jian Shui'er's purple hair mixed with perspiration stuck to her pink cheeks. She nodded lightly. No matter how calm she appeared on the surface after this night, there was still some lingering fear in her heart. Otherwise, she wouldn't have thought of testing the strange taste of the cigarette. If you haven't smoked before, then don't smoke. Su Lu held the cigarette in his mouth and said vaguely. The half-burnt cigarette stuck to his cracked lips and trembled with his words, as if he was fishing. The cockpit of the mecha was oppressive, and the communication system was silent. Su Lu could roughly imagine that the Iron 7th Division in the valley should have already started preparing for the upcoming second bloody battle. However, he and this Black MX were already exhausted to the extreme. He wanted to kill the enemy, but he couldn't turn around. He could only use his fingers to push the control stick and slowly drive the black MX on the military road to Luoqiu Airport. Not bad. At this moment, a white symbol flashed in the vision of Su Li's left eye. He had already taken off his special helmet, so these words naturally didn't appear on the holographic screen but in his mind. Of course, only that old bastard could create such a mysterious scene. This black MX mecha that had been carefully modified by Shang Qiu and the Nutshell engineering team had maximized Su Li's operating ability to the extreme. However, it wasn't designed with autopilot. Su Lu stared at the symbol in his left eye and suddenly had a strong urge to squeeze the old bastard's strength. If the glory of the charter was a mountain of treasures, then today Su Lu had been sitting on the edge of this glittering mountain and eating his meal. He had to eat as much as he could. Otherwise, before he ran out of treasures, who knew if the charter computer would go crazy and come crashing down on him? I'm very tired. Help me drive this MX to Luoqiu Airport. Su Lu chuckled, silently saying this in his heart. Then, he let go of his hands that were controlling the mecha and leaned back tiredly but comfortably into his special seat cushion. Maybe you'll feel better after sleeping for a while. I'm already impressed that you didn't throw up. He carefully untied Jian Shui's tightly bound clothes, allowing the girl's body, which had been restrained for a long time, to welcome a temporary release. When the soft bulge under the military uniform returned to its original shape, it was a soul-stirring and graceful scene. The dark short skirt was no longer pulled up by the shy rope, and the two slender, smooth and tight legs could finally be covered by the dazzling spring scenery. This process was even more seductive than the previous scene. If it had been in the past, every inch of Jian Shui's youthful body would have made Su Lu open his beady eyes wide to explore the beauty within. At this moment, however, he was already so tired that he could not speak. Seeing Jian Shui close her eyes tiredly, he naturally closed his own eyes as well. The glory of the charter, which freely traversed the atmosphere of the universe and planets, and the Federal Central Computer, which was at the core of the light, after hearing Su Li's request, did not express any more opinions. Neither the Federation nor the Empire had developed the technology to remotely control battleships or mecha. This was because the structures of battleships and mecha were abnormally complex, not as simple as the miniature surveillance aircraft commonly used by the Empire. The current computing power of the computers in the universe could not support remote control. Even the extremely powerful Federal Central Computer, the federal military had never attempted to allow it to complete this kind of remote autonomous control. Firstly, they did not have the authority to do so. Secondly, in their opinion, although the Federal Central Computer's computing power was amazing, it was ultimately just a cold machine. It could be imitated as much as it wanted, but it could never truly support the extremely complex operations. In addition to data calculation and environmental monitoring feedback, it also required intuitive judgment operations. However, at this moment in the dull cockpit, a young man and woman fell into a deep sleep. The heavily damaged black MX mecha, under the condition that no one was controlling it, gradually began to increase its speed. It smoothly and accurately crossed the mountains, the mountain roads and the fields, heading towards the Luoqiu spaceport in the distance. At this moment the black mecha was really like a black ghost. The low and powerful roar of the engines shattered the silence of the night. Countless heavy Imperial armored vehicles and the 14 third-generation Moon Wolf mechas mixed in with the vanguard mercilessly crushed the fertile soil on the planet's surface. The engines that used hydrogen fuel did not have a bad smell, but the high-speed advance of such a large force still left behind an unpleasant smell of engine oil in the air. The last reorganized force of the Empire's Maple Forest Alliance, the Reserve Assault Brigade, had already arrived at the area very close to the front line of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. After a continuous night of large-scale air and ground joint transport and the mechanized rapid march after breaking into the southern hemisphere, the Empire soldiers in the fields as dense as the grassland felt a wave of fatigue. The establishment of a brigade in the Empire was larger than that of a division in the Federation. Not to mention, this assault brigade was the last trump card of the Maple Forest Alliance. Its soldiers were close to 20,000 people, and its armored firepower was also the strongest in the Alliance. The highest commander of this assault brigade was Major General Hughes. Under the puzzled eyes of the staff officers, the 40-year-old general ordered all the troops to slow down the speed of the advance. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the image he had just received. He fell into deep thought, and the wrinkles on his forehead piled up particularly heavy. 10 minutes ago, when he lost the coordinates and information of the Moonwolf group, Major General Hughes knew that something must have happened in front of him. However, military orders must be obeyed. In addition, after confirming that there was only one division in the Yellow Mountain Ridge area, he only asked the electronic troops to increase the anti-interference force and began to build a temporary position command system. He did not ask the troops to slow down the speed of the advance until the few remaining miniature aircraft of the Empire sent back a few still images. There were not many miniature surveillance aircraft scattered in the southern hemisphere like locusts, and these few surveillance aircraft had no way to get close to the Yellow Mountain Ridge area. They could only take a few pictures from an extremely long distance. The pictures were very tragic. Those familiar black and blue mecha tragically collapsed in the valleys on the ground, burning and deforming. Major General Hughes's face was like iron. He could not understand how a single division in the Federation could eat an entire mecha brigade led by Lov. However, the pictures in front of him told him that this was the truth. What should he do now? Sitting in the command armored vehicle, he slowly closed his eyes. After a while, he suddenly opened them, and a trace of ferocity flashed through his eyes. His assault team was already stronger than the Federal Division to begin with. In addition, although the Federal Division had wiped out the entire Moonwolf mecha clan, they must have paid an extremely heavy price. He had a very good chance of wiping out the entire Federal Division. Then he would directly attack Wuxia spaceport, then take a detour to the north and threaten the Federation's vital military depot. From there, he would write the most important chapter of the North-South War on the planet's surface. He must continue to attack. Suddenly, Major General Hughes's expression froze, because in the Imperial New Moon command system in front of him, an old voice rang out. Retreat. The Imperial armies had strict hierarchy and discipline. Although Major General Hughes was disappointed and even angry, since this was the command center, and it was old General Umbree's order, he had to accept it. In the shortest amount of time, he issued the order to retreat to the entire assault brigade. However, at this moment Major General Hughes made a fatal mistake. He left behind the Mecha Brigade and the Heavy Mecha Brigade, and tried to use mechanical cooperation and shoulder-launched electromagnetic beam bombs to deal with the Federation's most mobile Mecha Brigade. From a standard military plan, this arrangement was not wrong. The Imperial Brigade had to retreat without firing a single shot, so they had to retreat completely. In his opinion, as long as they could choke the Federal Army's fastest mecha squad to death, there was no way the Federal Army would be able to catch up to the fully mechanized Imperial Brigade that had not suffered any losses in the wilderness that stretched for 200 kilometers. At the exit of the valley, Shimin Jin took off her earpiece and said to Du Shaoqing, "The enemy is preparing to retreat." When the Moonwolf group was wiped out in 3 minutes, the 3 mecha clans of the Iron 7th Division secretly withdrew from the mountain area. Under the cover of the night, they advanced towards the north and set up an ambush circle in the forest. However, before the two sides came into contact with each other, the Empire forces retreated first. This did not shock Du Shaoqing, because any possible changes in the battle situation were within his tactical calculations. In fact, he had long been prepared for the decisive retreat of the Imperial troops. Under his calm and clear command, the entire Iron 7th Division left the valley. It looked like they were preparing for an ambush, but in reality, they were already prepared for a high-speed pursuit. This outstanding Major General of the Federation slowly put on his sunglasses and said, "Inform the troops to keep chasing. Even if we chase to 30 degrees north latitude, we cannot lose them. Until we chase these Empire forces off our land." The first to clash fiercely, the first to light up half of the night sky, was the Mecha Battalion of the Empire forces, the Heavy Infantry branch, and more than 20 of the Federation's new MX mechas. The Empire forces originally wanted to use the mechas as a distraction, but the Heavy Infantry carried universal launchers and fired concentrated electromagnetic beam bombs to eliminate this group of Federation mecha that were clearly at the front. However, they found that they had made a fatal mistake. The unparalleled weapon used to deal with mechas on the battlefield, those concentrated electromagnetic beam bombs, could not hit the Federation mechas at all. After the electromagnetic beam bombs exploded, the blue arcs of high-voltage material gushed out, spreading out such a large effective attack radius, but it still could not lock onto the Federation mecha in an effective area. The mobility of these Black Federation mechas was too strong, and their speed was too fast. The Empire's heavy infantry division fired these electromagnetic beam bombs 4 out of 5, but in the end, only 3 of the Black Federation mechas were destroyed. What was even more frightening was that while the Empire's soldiers were still adhering to the inherent rules of teamwork, fighting and retreating at the same time, the Federation's Black Mecha had long abandoned all of those rules and regulations. Relying on their powerful firepower and performance, they launched a high-speed group charge. Like an extremely tightly clenched heavy metal fist, they smashed viciously into the Empire's final line of defense. Like a knife piercing through a piece of paper, the Black Federation mecha broke through this line of defense and chased after the Empire's armored brigade in the field not far away. Behind them, the Iron 7th Division's armored vehicles roared and roared, also increasing their speed. Chapter 425. On the huge screen, red arrows were rapidly expanding from south to north. These red arrows represented the Iron 7th Division. More than 10 kilometers ahead of the Iron 7th Division, the Blue Imperial armies were trying to escape from the battlefield as quickly as possible. However, the mixed mechanized platoon they left behind to stop them had long become some kind of sacrifice for the Iron 7th Division's fierce offensive. Now they could not complete their mission of retreating at all. The Imperial Assault Group should have been defending and waiting for reinforcements at this time, but the military intelligence they received from the Northern Hemisphere Command was very bad. The situation on the north-south dividing line had fundamentally changed. 2 divisions of the Federation were rushing in from the northeast. If the enemy blocked the 20,000-man army south of the dividing line, what awaited them would be a crushing defeat. Therefore, this automated platoon could only try their best to retreat as quickly as possible. The Iron 7th Division attacked from 3 directions, crazily pouncing out from the Mayan plains and chasing after the enemy across the mountains and plains. When they were about to reach the rear of the Imperial Brigade, the 3 iron streams suddenly split into countless low-level combat platoons and stabbed toward the rear of the Imperial Brigade. On the screen, the crimson blocks that represented the Iron 7th Division suddenly split into many lines. They did not care about the coverage of the enemy's firepower at all and rushed forward fearlessly. There was no division or encirclement, and there was no roundabout way. There was only the most direct of straight lines. And when these straight lines that represented a battalion or even a company bit fiercely into the Imperial platoon, the ends of the line suddenly opened up again and cleverly began to divide the firepower, and then bit down on the Imperial platoon in an orderly manner. Clouds of smoke floated in the wild night from time to time. In the dozens of square kilometers of combat area that was stretched into the shape of leaves, there were blinding lights and explosions at the same time. Specific orders were sent out from the electronic command system of the Iron 7th Division headquarters, passing through the pungent air and the dust of the explosions, and transmitted to every single combat platoon. Sometimes orders were even directly issued to platoon-level combat units, calmly and skillfully commanding the federal forces like countless sharp knives, cutting the Imperial armies into bloody pieces. The commander of the Iron 7th Division was Du Shaoqing. This famous general of a generation, who had never been on a real battlefield, finally demonstrated his commanding ability and terrifying mental fortitude in the smoke of this planet. He was like the most brilliant conductor in the universe. Waving the stick in his hand softly, he had the complete control of an enormous and complicated ancient music orchestra in his hands. Even the tiniest change in tone or the smallest movement of the performers could not escape his eyes. But Du Shaoqing did not arrogantly try to personally command every single battle on the battlefield, because he knew very well that he was not a charter computer with superhuman computing power. He was only following the tactical calculations of the General Staff Department. At this time, the countless parameters given to him by the glory of the charter allowed him to judge the situation and adjust the general direction of every battle at any time, thus winning the final victory for his Iron 7th Division. The Imperial Assault Group was the trump card of the Expeditionary Army to begin with. Even though they were being chased by the ruthless and relentless attacks of the Iron 7th Division, they still did not panic. The soldiers of the Empire still fought bravely and valiantly, But when faced with the 20 or so black MX mechas that were like tigers in a flock of sheep, they found it extremely difficult to deal with. An hour later, in a certain valley that was still a considerable distance away from the north-south dividing line, the retreating Imperial Brigade could no longer endure the incessant attacks of the Federation mecha, and the incessant attacks of the retreating Federation mecha. The entire army instantly spread out on their own initiative and began to fight in small squads. They increased their speed and avoided the attacks behind them as they sprinted towards the northern hemisphere at high speed. At this point in the battle, whether it was the retreating Imperial Brigade or the pursuing Iron 7th Division, it was very difficult for them to maintain their formation. Like countless balls, they began to run wildly across the plains. Sometimes a Federation battalion would be sandwiched between two Empire battalions. Sometimes a small Empire battalion would find themselves despairingly surrounded by more than 400 Federation tanks. The pursuit turned into a chaotic battle. At this moment, the accurate monitoring of the battlefield by the central computer of the Federation, and the commanding ability of Du Shaoqing, and the officers of the headquarters who could not have been calmer and more meticulous finally played their biggest role. In the darkness of the night, the Imperial Brigade that was like an axe had long been turned into countless fierce and wild pieces of metal. The Iron 7th Division that was like a machete had also been broken into pieces. However, they were like countless sharp knives. It seemed chaotic, but in reality there was order amidst the chaos. Every company that was in the midst of the complex terrain clearly knew their position, their mission, and still maintained a fierce attacking posture. In the Southern Hemisphere Federation Command Center. Commander Shaoqing, you really live up to your reputation. As a high-ranking military officer in the Westwoods, Lieutenant General Nelson did not have a good impression of Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division. However, today, after personally witnessing Du Shaoqing's command and the valiant military quality of the Iron 7th Division, he still felt a sense of admiration. Although the Empire's assault brigade showed no signs of truly collapsing at this rate, by the time the Federation's two divisions that went to reinforce the Empire's assault brigade in the south, victory was already set in stone. Scenes like this on the battlefield were constantly happening in the narrow area at the northern end of the southern hemisphere of Planet 5460. The Empire's Maple Forest Alliance, which had forcefully launched a surprise attack in the south and successfully killed its way to the Federation's third defense line, was like a high-speed cannonball that had shot through countless layers of alloy baffles. At the moment of exhaustion, the tide-like offensive was contained, and the Federal Army, which had been pressured to the point of suffocation, began to gain a rare moment of respite. Then, under the orders of the Federation Command Center and the guidance of the glory of the Charter, the Federal Army in the Southern Hemisphere began a counterattack. The cold Charter computer could not completely dominate the war on this planet. It only provided the most terrifying battlefield data and real-time comprehensive monitoring for the Federation Command Center to formulate a plan. At the same time, the powerful computing power of the Charter computer also began to carry out the most detailed tactical deduction for the counterattack. However, this magnificent counterattack did not achieve as great a result as the Iron 7th Division on the front line north of the Yellow Mountain Ridge. On the one hand, the Federation's main force was under the continuous and terrifying attacks of the Empire's Maple Forest Alliance. Their own morale and equipment had been greatly depleted, so it was difficult for a hasty counterattack to display their might. More importantly, before the Federal Army began their counterattack, those roaring, cold-blooded Imperial Expeditionary Force that had been continuously attacking suddenly seemed to have received some kind of order and instantly began to retreat. These Empire's troops attacked like a tidal wave and retreated like a tidal wave. When they attacked, they did not care about the fact that they had all died in battle. When they retreated, they were silent to the extreme. Only in the 300-square battle zones on the north-south dividing line were countless corpses from both sides, as well as tens of thousands of tons of dirt and charred chariots and mecha wreckages that filled the field of vision. Umburi, you're really ruthless. But what exactly are you thinking? Lieutenant General Nelson's white eyebrows furrowed together. Looking at the receding Imperial Expeditionary Force on the light screen, his heart was abnormally heavy. No matter the cost, they had thrown away more than 40,000 corpses, moved out their family assets hidden in the glaciers, wasted so much ammunition, and finally reached the Federation's last line of defense. In the end, with one order from the command center, the bloodthirsty Empire soldiers retreated without hesitation. They did not linger in the battle, nor did they lament. As a senior commander, Lieutenant General Nelson knew very well that such a large group retreat on the front line proved the terrifying military quality and discipline of these Empire soldiers. Countless chariots rumbled across the planet's surface that was riddled with holes. The great battle of hundreds of thousands of people was played out in the darkness before dawn. The entire planet was playing out one magnificent and eye-catching scene after another. The 15 main divisions of the Federal Army set out to attack the Northern Hemisphere. This had already entered the third phase of the Ministry of Defense's plan. Under the guidance of the glory of the Charter, they chose the route to advance at high speed. Once they entered the Northern Hemisphere, they would lose this advantage. No one knew that the Federal Central Computer, which was busy guiding the planetary battle, was actually doing something else at this moment, that was driving for people, or in other words, turning on the engines. A wisp of white willow appeared at the edge of the sky. The faint light shone on Wuxia Airport, illuminating the heavy firepower weapons with a charming metallic luster. A tremor came from the distant night forest. A severely damaged black mech walked into the base under the aim of countless heavy weapons. The officer of the airport, who had already received the information, drove a ladder car to the front of the tall mech. The hatch of the black mech slowly opened. Sulu, whose face was pale, carried the still unconscious Jian Shui, out of the mech under the shocked eyes of countless Federation soldiers. After waking up, Jian Shui was taken to the living area by a female officer to take a bath. Sulu, however, asked an officer to take him to the cafeteria. Although he had already eaten 4 high-density energy bars in the mech, those things could not satisfy his extremely empty stomach. The second lieutenant in charge of leading the way looked at him with admiration and said, "Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, the food will be here soon." Sulu nodded and suddenly said, "Can you lend me your phone for a moment?" "It would be my pleasure," said the second lieutenant sincerely and happily. In addition to this excited second lieutenant, there were many officers of the airport watching from a distance with curiosity and excitement. In today's military, Sulu was no longer just a name but a celebrity. Not to mention at this time, many officers already knew about this young lieutenant colonel's outstanding achievements in today's Federation attack and defense battle. Sulu had just dialed a number when a large pile of plates was placed in front of his table. He stared at the plate of ugly red food in front of him and was stunned. 5460 River Special Crab. High in protein. "You should need it right now," said the second lieutenant nervously. Sulu stared at the crab on the plate and shook his head. "I don't like to eat this. Please give me a bowl of noodles, preferably a big bowl." Chapter 426. Jian Shuier took a shower very quickly. When the cook in the airport cafeteria brought the carefully cooked noodles to the table, she also came here and sat quietly and obediently across from Sulu. From this point of view, she didn't look like a big star who was popular all over the universe. The girl who had just taken a shower was wearing a dark green military shirt. The collar was tight, but because it was too loose, it always made people want to explore the scenery under the shirt. The fluffy and playful short purple hair was now smooth like a purple satin, sticking to her cheeks. There were a few drops of water at the end of the hair that were crystal clear. She was like a beautiful lotus flower lying on the quiet surface of the water, painted with a layer of strange color by the strange light. Her whole body was oozing wet like the morning fog, moving people. Sulu looked up and asked, "Do you want to eat some?" Jian Shuier tiredly shook her head and said, "I vomited so much that I can't eat anything. I don't know how you can still have such a good appetite." After saying this, she put her head on her arms and rested her head on the table, looking at Sulu's side face with a trace of curiosity and interest. The young girl's face was slightly pale at this moment, but it also carried an unhealthy redness that was caused by the heat and running around. However, her sharp chin rested on her arm, forcibly turning her delicate and tired face into a bit of pure beauty. The pink cheeks around her lips were squeezed until they were slightly puffed up, like a cute little bun, making people want to take a bite out of them. Sulu's hand that was holding the chopsticks slightly froze. He suppressed the surprise in his heart and awkwardly stopped looking at her. He clumsily took the pepper bottle on the table and mechanically poured it into the bowl of noodles. He forced himself not to think that this national girl was staring at him. Relying on his instinct, He began to bravely attack the noodles in front of him. He ate a column of noodles with his chopsticks and drank half a bowl of soup with both hands. The spicy smell of pepper mixed with chili rushed into his nose, making him very comfortable. Sulu ate until his forehead was full of sweat. He was so satisfied that he actually forgot a lot of things such as the battlefield last night, the smoking corpses in the wilderness and mountains, and Jian Shuer who was sitting next to him and staring at him seriously at this time. A bowl of noodles was finished. Another bowl of noodles was finished. No one came to disturb the officers of Luoqiao Airport. The empty hall was quiet. Only the two of them sat in a remote corner by the window. Only the sound of wind sweeping away the clouds sounded. The morning light outside the window gradually crossed the mountain forest and shone on the surface of the building. The slightly white light penetrated the floor glass and reflected on Su Li's sweaty face. Jian Shuer tilted her head and opened her big eyes to look seriously at this ordinary face in the morning light. She knew that this student of her father's would often have an incomparably natural and friendly smile on his face. However, in the cockpit of the mecha, at certain moments, when his smile would disappear and his face would become serious, there would always be some kind of wonderful light between those ordinary eyebrows. Last night, during the thousands of miles of escape, during the mecha battle in the valley, she had been sitting quietly and obediently beside Su Lu. She had been shaken to the point where it was incomparably painful. However, most of the time she had been seriously looking at the screen in the mecha, watching Su Lu wearing a helmet, watching him do many things. The more she saw, the more she naturally knew, and the more curious she became. For a woman, curiosity was often a very fatal emotion. However, our nation's maiden had a calm enough heart under her cute and playful appearance. Thus, she was not like the daughter of the Nanxiang family, who might ruin a person's life the moment she saw him. Until now, she was still just curious. Who knew what this emotion would develop into in the future? Sulu put down the third empty bowl and rubbed his abdomen in satisfaction. He used the sweaty sleeve of his shirt to randomly wipe his sweat and mouth. Jian Shuer suddenly opened her mouth and asked seriously, "Who did you learn from?" Sulu was startled, but immediately understood what she was asking. In terms of mecha piloting, he had many teachers. For example, Bai Yulan, Zhou Yu, and even Li Feng, who he had sparred with before. He would never let go of any opportunity to learn and improve himself. Back then, he had relied on that strange mecha battle room in Lihua University and that thin and weak young master of the Tai family to learn the basics. However, in the end he only had one teacher. It was that teacher who had taught him how to discover, get used to, and use the trembling heat in his body. "It was uncle who taught me," said Sulu very seriously. Jian Shuer's face showed a trace of peaceful sweetness and pride. She said, "So that father of mine is also very strong." Sulu smiled. On the beach outside the Golden Star Hotel, the young girl in front of him had not asked more about uncle. Now, it seemed that those curiosity and doubts about her birth father had been hidden in her heart all this time. Uncle is a very impressive person. He gazed at Jian Shuer and thought silently to himself that in this part of the universe, probably only that great military god could be a match for uncle. Right at this moment, the phone beside his hand beeped. Earlier, when he had entered the cafeteria, he had made a call. However, this planet was too far away from the capital ring, so the call took too long. Furthermore, that second lieutenant's authority was too low, so the call was only officially connected after he had finished his noodles. However, it had to be said that the speed at which he ate his noodles was comparable to a hungry ghost about to be reincarnated. The time delay of in-universe instant communication could not be solved. After all, that involved a deeper level of research in quantum physics. Even Professor Shen was unable to touch upon this somewhat mysterious boundary. Sulu held the phone and listened to a woman's voice from afar. A woman wearing glasses and greasy work attire appeared before his eyes, but it could not hide her youthful face and great heart. He smiled slightly and said sincerely, "Shangqiu, I received your note. Thank you for adjusting that guy for me. It's very useful. Without this MX, it would have been very difficult for me to complete this mission. When I get back, I'll treat you to a meal." "Right, I've introduced a Chung Fengsher to you. He has some very interesting things in his hands. See if you need them." In terms of mecha, Shangqiu, the first-level technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department, was unquestionably a genius. Although this genius girl was gradually getting older, other than her youthful appearance, her talent in mecha design had not fallen behind at all. Su Li's gratitude was very sincere because he had been very comfortable controlling the Black MX that night. He knew very well that Shang Qiu and those colleagues in the engineering department must have put in a lot of effort in order to modify this mecha. Especially since they did not have their own control data, the amount of calculation required was terrifyingly large. Leaving a note in a mecha. If this was made into a movie, it would definitely be a battlefield romance that would attract countless young girls, said Jian Shuier, looking at him with a smile. Su Lu scratched his head. He really did not know how to explain it. There was indeed an indescribable sense of chemistry between him and Shang Qiu. Although the two of them had only been able to communicate remotely this past year, whether it was in the development of the MX in the past or in the creation of mecha tutorials later on, this pair of stunningly talented engineering man and woman had always been able to easily understand what the other wanted, thus forming a close collaboration. However, this was definitely not the love between a man and a woman. It was just a natural attraction between living things that shared the same magnetic field. Su Lu thought so, but when he thought of the exaggeratedly soft breasts that had appeared in his mind earlier, he felt that he was lying to himself. He did have a good impression of Shang Qiu. Right now, he did not have to think about the black-rimmed spectacles wearing Zhang Xiaoming, but he would occasionally think of the spectacle-wearing Shang Qiu. Su Lu gripped the edge of the table tightly, gazing somewhat uneasily at the morning light outside the window. Suddenly, he thought of the young lady of the Southern Prime Minister family, who had courageously expressed her love for him in the Wood Valley Manor. He thought of the warm, peaceful and comfortable feeling that beautiful girl had brought to him. Suddenly, Su Lu came to a conclusion that made him panic. Could it be that he subconsciously liked all girls who were worth liking? Then what was this? Amorous or universal? Promiscuous or lustful? Had he been led astray by that hooligan Mr. Sher? The morning light was a little blinding. Su Lu quickly turned his head, and then saw Jian Shuier, who was looking at him curiously with her head resting on his arm. He saw that incomparably enchanting little face, that short purple hair that had always existed in his dreams. He could not help but feel confused and even panicked. He quickly stood up, prepared to get as far away from this national girl as possible. Jian Shuier opened her ink-black eyes and looked at him in confusion. She asked, "What's wrong?" Su Li's voice was slightly hoarse. "I'm going to rest for a while first, and then I'll fix my mecha. In the next few days I'll definitely have to go out on missions." Jian Shuier was shocked. She pointed at the white salt stains on the back of his military uniform and asked hesitantly, "Aren't you going to take a shower first?" The afternoon sun shone warmly into the bedroom. Jian Shuier was nestled in bed, eating seriously with a bag of coarse grain biscuits in her hand, while looking at the TV screen on the wall. She looked like she was at home, completely different from the scene of war that was going on everywhere on this planet at this time. The Federation's army was fighting a bloody battle, and Jian Shuier was not in the mood to live such a leisurely life. It was just that the Imperial Expeditionary Force's surprise attack plan had been foiled by the Federation, but the entire Luoqiu spaceport was still in the highest alert state. Under strict military control, although she and Su Lu enjoyed the best military treatment in the spaceport, it was still very inconvenient if they wanted to go out for a walk. Not to mention that the news on the TV was particularly important at this time. On the screen, at the large gathering site of the Charter Square in the capital's special district, President Pabre, dressed in a black suit, was reading an important announcement to thousands of ordinary citizens of the Federation under the sun. Dozens of years ago, the President of the Federation once said that this is a shameful day. Today I want to announce to the entire Federation, and even the entire universe, that today is a day that is worth remembering for the rest of our lives. Speaking of this, the dark-skinned President Pabre paused for a moment, as if he was recalling the heavy history of the past. Gradually, a smile appeared on his face, and he looked particularly confident under the sun. Chapter 427. Under the sunlight, President Pabre looked at the camera calmly and said, "The code name of this military operation is Victory, because we will definitely achieve the final victory." The Charter Square was filled with jubilation, but there was also solemnity amidst the jubilation. For tens of thousands of years, the humans of the Federation had floated alone in the dark universe. In the colonial galaxies and the newly developed space zones, they did not find any relatives. Gradually, they lost their obsession to find extraterrestrial life. With a hint of sadness and a hint of pride, they confirmed that they were the only crystallization of wisdom in the universe, the leader of all things. However, in the last few years of the last constitutional era, people were shocked to discover that on the other side of the Night Scorpion Nebula, intelligent life that was extremely similar to them actually existed. Although the political systems of the two parties were different, from the perspective of biology and natural selection, the people of the Federation and the people of the Imperium walked on the path of carbon-based life with their heads held high. There was no essential difference at all. Some anthropologists even began to boldly suspect that before the unknown catastrophe, the human societies on the two sides of the universe were vaguely connected. The people of the Federation might not be orphans in the first place. Where did we come from? Was it the same place? They lacked evidence, only sunny and optimistic inferences. Unfortunately, such inferences did not have the time to develop into movies, novels, stage plays, or even the warmth of universal diplomacy before they were directly turned into smoke by the flames of war that year. As a result, what might have been a comedy of distant relatives holding hands and weeping together became a tragedy of flowers and silver trees blooming in the sky and blood flowing on the yellow soil once they met. From the day the flames of war began, the competition between the Federation and the Imperium was painted with a layer of thick, hellish ink by blood and death. No one ever explored the endless stories between the two civilizations that were so similar that it made one's hair stand on end. The negative emotions of anger, sorrow, pain, and darkness, as well as the impassioned words of revenge and resistance, flooded into the lives and emotions of all the citizens of the Federation. At this point, the stars shone brightly. There was no other choice but to completely defeat the Imperium. In the words of George Carlin, one of the few people who talked about the Empire, it was that every citizen of the Federation had to be a natural anti-empire. In the last few days of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar, the West Woods border, which had been peaceful on the surface for the past 10 years, started to fight again. The Federation, which had been waiting patiently for 10 years, started to move. Tens of billions of citizens of the Federation were excited, cheering and talking non-stop. After the gathering at Charter Square, the news channels of major TV stations began to mobilize all their resources to report on the biggest event of the decade. On the other hand, the Federation News Channel, which occupied the most authoritative position, had even cancelled all of its routine news programs. Instead, it began to use text, pictures, and video to broadcast live the battle at the border of Ceylon continuously. The Federation mobilized 94 divisions in the early hours of this morning to launch the final general attack on the remaining invaders of the Empire on the 3 planets at the border of the West Woods. With a solemn expression, the female news anchor with delicate features lowered her head slightly. She quickly flipped through the electronic text prompt screen and said at a very fast speed, "According to the latest battle report sent by the Department of Defense, we can now confirm that the main force of this victorious military operation came from the West Woods military region. The one responsible for the interstellar military force transportation is the Federation's Second Fleet." At this time, a video provided by the federal military appeared on the news screen. In the vast and dark universe, a fleet of more than 40 Federation giant warships, which stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers, was heading toward a certain inconspicuous galaxy in the distance. The light of the stars on the right rear shone on the majestic fleet, making the hull of the space warship shine, making the scene look extremely magnificent. The female news anchor held a digital pen in her hand and asked in a sincere and respectful tone, "Professor Lee, President Pabre has declared war on the Empire. According to your calculations, how long will it take for the Federation to complete the first phase of the plan?" Lee Jae-do, the Vice Dean of the 1st Military Academy, replied with a smile, "The Imperial Expeditionary Force's supply of troops has not been interrupted, but as long as the 2 space channels are in our hands, the first phase of the attack should not be too big of a problem." As the only son of the military god Lee Pifu, Lee Jae-do had always been taciturn and low-key in the federal military and political circles. The people of the Federation did not know much about him. Originally, he was not willing to appear on the news program, But the Federation government had to ask him to appear in order to explain the war to the people for so long. After all, he was a member of the Lees of Philadelphia, so the people of the Federation would definitely trust him more than the spokesperson of the government. In fact, he knew very well that the image shown on the news was from 10 hours ago. At this time, almost all of the mechanized troops of the Westwoods military had probably arrived in the sky above the two planets and were in the midst of a forceful landing battle. In the studio, a white-haired war strategist frowned in confusion and asked Director Lee, "Director Lee, as far as I know, the fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force has been cautiously wandering around the periphery of the region. That is the desolate region. The Federation has not been able to obtain an accurate star map. This time, the Second Fleet is cruising at full capacity at high speed. Once that fleet launches a surprise attack, the flames of war in the Westwoods region rose again." The military scientists in the Capitol Ring were most vigilant and puzzled about why the Department of Defense dared to use the Second Fleet to carry out the full-capacity transportation plan. After all, the Imperial Expeditionary Force fleet that was like a ghost whose location could not be determined was really a big problem. The fleet of the Empire is currently in the 5460 system. Lee Jae-do was not used to sitting in front of the camera. He smiled and coughed twice before saying, "But I believe that they will never be able to return to the star system they are familiar with to be ghosts." The news immediately shocked all the staff in the studio and the countless viewers in front of the TV. Director Lee Jae-do suddenly remembered the mission that Mr. President had given him and said to the camera, "The goal of the first phase of the plan is to drive the people of the Empire away from the three resource star systems. According to the host's question, according to my judgment, it will take the Federal Army at most 1.5 years to complete this historical mission." The female host suddenly opened her eyes wide and asked an extremely unprofessional question that hit the nail on the head. "The military operation is codenamed Victory. Does it have anything to do with the National Girls' Victory Concert? Resource Star System? Did they really want the public to believe that there were only mines and military bases there, but no Federation citizens?" Jian Shuer looked at Rong Pingjing's cousin on the TV and frowned slightly. A hint of mockery flashed in her eyes. Including 5460, in the three star systems that had fallen into the hands of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, there were close to 2 million Federation citizens who had been trapped under the iron hooves of the Empire for several decades. Meanwhile, the Federation government had always ignored them for the sake of the greater strategic arrangements. Hiding the truth from the public, however, this was ultimately a decision that the government, parliament, and military had no choice but to make many years ago. This time's Federation government was at least correcting the mistakes that the Federation had made in the past. Doing some propaganda and embellishing was understandable. Jian Shuer lowered her head slightly as she thought to herself. A moment later, she raised her head and watched the replay of President Pabre's speech on the TV. A trace of a smile appeared on her face. A mature president or politician should announce the start of war before the midterm elections, or the next term of office. On one hand, this would increase the chances of success and reduce the risk. On the other hand, it would also help them gain more electoral support. However, President Pabre had ignored the collective opposition of his staff when the new MX Mecha had just been equipped to the army. He had used his superb political skills to unify the opposing views in Parliament and forcefully push through the military deployment plan of the Ministry of Defense despite the objections of the masses. This kind of decision might seem a little radical, but hidden within this radical was a certain political philosophy that was worthy of respect. Under Mr. Pabre's tanned and simple face, it was precisely this respectable way of thinking that was completely different from most politicians that allowed him to win the recognition and respect of many Federation youths, such as Tai Ziuan and Su Lu. Just like many people, Jian Shuer also greatly admired this Mr. President who had come from a poor background. Because of her family background, she vaguely knew some of the inside story. This Westwoods war plan was completely proposed and single-handedly pushed forward by this charismatic Mr. President. For this matter, the president had even made a special trip to Philadelphia. The TV began to play the second video released by the Ministry of Defense. She carefully watched the federal fleet on the screen as if they were transporting a flock of birds. They used the air-to-ground transport pods to deliver the heavy equipment and soldiers of the landing force to the two unfamiliar planets. Looking at the explosions that continued to erupt from the two planets, the hands hanging by her waist gradually tightened. The national girl Jian Shui'er was the fuse of this war. It was hard to believe, but this was the truth. Furthermore, she was a top student from the 1st Military Academy's Warship Command Department. Her family background allowed her to hide an intelligent military sense under her cute appearance. Seeing this, she roughly understood the federal military's grand plan. She was the bait, and even the Federation's attack in the southern hemisphere of 5460 was just a disguise. From the very beginning, the federal military's plan was to transfer the last fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force to this star sector, and then begin to attack the other two planets with a thunderous force. Those two planets had been completely occupied and operated by the Imperial Expeditionary Force for many years. The situation was completely different from the situation on 5460. In order to tear open a hole in such an environment and establish an outpost for the Federation's counterattack, the Westwoods military region had to complete a sudden landing raid in the shortest time possible. And this first they had to transfer the last fleet of the Empire away. A light flashed through Jian Shui'er's ink-like eyes. Her delicate lips opened slightly, and she let out a sigh of admiration. This was a simple military plan. Although it had successfully deceived the people of the Empire and even many of the Federation's participating troops, no matter whether it was the reaction of the Maple Federation, the mobilization of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, or the advance arrival of the Federal Fleet, as long as there was an unexpected situation in one step, this plan could not be carried out. The person who made this plan had calculated all of the Empire's countermeasures without a single mistake. It was a simple and light placement of chess pieces, but it landed in every place where the enemy would definitely advance and retreat. What kind of realm was this? This was a terrifying realm where one had grasped every gust of wind on the battlefield in one's hand and grasped the reactions of people to the extreme. Thus, it appeared to be at their fingertips at ease, and with great complexity as simple as it was simple. Jian Shui'er thought in surprise. The old man had already retired. Why did he come out of retirement this time? Chapter 429. Jian Shui'er could be cute and innocent in front of her family, but she could also be youthful, adorable, charming, and witty to the point of being natural. She could make countless members of the opposite sex fall head over heels in love with her, and be willing to live a life of poverty for her. This kind of natural ability probably had some kind of indescribable mystery to it. This was the real her, but it was not the entire her. The other part of her was unwilling to use the intelligence and ability she had developed at First Hospital, and her home in Philadelphia, to figure out the dangers and complexities of the human world. However, right now she could not get rid of her doubts. They were like clouds that forever covered the night sky, blocking out the thousands of stars that scattered down from the universe. It made it difficult for her to keep her heart pure and clear even if she wanted to. At this moment, she needed to discuss the heavy and deep doubts in her heart with someone close and trustworthy. And on this planet, there was no doubt that there was only that small-eyed man. After going through a complicated authorization check, she was brought by the female officer to a large warehouse in the depths of the underground base of the spaceport. The national maiden looked at the scene in front of her and covered her slightly gaping mouth in shock. The underground warehouse was very large and spacious. A large black MX mecha of the Federation hung on a platform suspended in mid-air. The heavily damaged outer shell on the left side of the mecha had already been dismantled, revealing the dizzyingly complex mechanical structure inside. It looked like a human skeleton specimen from a medical school, except that it had a faint metallic glow. Also, because it was too large, it gave off a strong sense of oppression for the people in the warehouse. On the left side of the black MX, a simple automatic assembly line suspended 5 meters in the air was moving in many parts with a clatter. Below the assembly line, 6 officers were recording something with serious expressions on their faces. In their hands, the electronic repair records kept flashing rapidly, recording in detail every movement seen with the naked eye. The dark blue patch on their left shoulders indicated that they were Federation repair officers. One of the officers wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked at the guy on the black mecha who was silently climbing and jumping like an ape. He said in shock, I always thought that my repair skills were already not bad at all. Sulu stood on the tall mecha. After a night of battle and thousands of miles of travel, even the newest generation MX mecha of the Federation, under the frenzied pursuit of the Empire's Moon Wolf Mecha Brigade, had still ended up riddled with holes in certain areas, with some systems extremely fragile. Sulu believed that the Department of Defense would give him a new dangerous mission. Therefore, after 2 hours of light sleep, he went to the warehouse. He wanted to fix the Black MX in the shortest amount of time possible. Pulling out a very long data cable, he narrowed his eyes as he stood below the Black mech. His fingers lightly touched the control panel on the terminal to remove the outer armor of the MX mech. He didn't really care about the gazes of the 6 mech technicians behind him. In truth, those who had the authority to enter this warehouse naturally had the right to get close to the MX mech. Sulu climbed to the platform below the left shoulder of the mech. Reaching out, he pulled out 2 data cables, broke them with force, and connected them to the workbench. Accompanied by the sound of motors, the light silver automatic repair arm rose from the mech. Shang Qiu had made many modifications to this Black MX. In her opinion, all the long-range firepower systems that Sulu needed had been completely removed. However, she had forcefully kept the automatic repair arm installed on the mech. This was because she knew that for a genius mechanic like Sulu, a standardized automatic repair arm was more important than anything else. The light alloy mechanical repair arm was lifted off the roof of the warehouse by a crane. Sulu rubbed his hair, narrowed his eyes and grunted. Both his hands grabbed the clasp of the repair arm and pressed a button. Bright electric sparks shot out from the top of the mechanical arm. The components that had been prepared beforehand were meticulously placed into the damaged interior of the mech. Then one by one they were quickly welded together. At this time Sulu was wearing a dark green singlet. His muscles, which were usually hidden, were clearly defined because he had to operate the extraordinarily heavy mechanical arm. They were filled with a sense of power that had yet to be unleashed. He wore sunglasses and quickly and accurately carried out the repair work. At the same time, he requested parts from the 6 mechanics below him. Standard loop shock absorber. Number 3 ball joint transmission rod. You don't have it? M52 knee joint transmission rod, please grind it down to a diameter of 3 centimeters. He stood tall on the mech, holding the mechanical repair arm, spitting out sparks. He was like the most courageous warrior of the Federation holding a Darlin rotary machine gun, firing continuously. Every operation he made, every part he requested, would make the 6 Federation mechanics below him tremble violently in their hearts. This was because they had never seen anyone carry out this kind of mechanical repair. Every micro-operation that the young officer on the Black mech did was so precise and appropriate. No one would have imagined that one person carrying a heavy repair arm could actually do so much repair work so quickly. Moreover, not a single action was superfluous. What made these mechanics even more fearful and worshipful was that in the beginning, they simply did not understand the intention of Sulu's repair actions. It was not until half a minute later that the embryonic form gradually came together that they more or less understood this kind of exquisite repair train of thought. They could not help but admit that Sulu, who was repairing the Black MX, had long surpassed them in terms of mechanical repair skills. No, he had surpassed the skill level of most of the mechanics in the Federation military by too much. The legend of one person repairing a mech, which was usually unimaginable, seemed to be slowly becoming a reality at this moment. Therefore, that mechanic was so shocked that he could only repeat a certain sentence over and over again. The mechanics beside him also silently felt the same way. One of them stared with his eyes wide and pursed his lips. Looking at Sulu, who had taken out a small knife and was cutting open a certain sealed circuit, he said in shock, "Can this kind of parallel serial circuit be replaced by a triple overlapping circuit? There's no such thing in the textbooks. We don't understand, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Don't forget, the MX was designed by him in the first place." The voices of the discussions were very soft, but Sulu, who was climbing up and down the Black mech, heard them clearly. He turned his head and said, "We don't have the materials now, so we can only make do like this. Do you have any solidifying gears here?" "Yes. I'll go look for them immediately," said the officer loudly, The mechanics in the underground warehouse had long been dumbfounded by Su Li's miraculous mechanical repair skills. They actually did not notice the arrival of Jian Shui'er outside the door at all. If it had been any other time, these soldiers would have probably fainted from excitement upon seeing the nation's girl suddenly appear by their side. However, at this moment, they had long been completely focused on the mechanical repair skills displayed by Su Lu, completely forgetting about everything else. Jian Shui'er had a military uniform draped over her shoulders. Her arms were crossed in front of her chest as she leaned against the door, watching the scene in front of her with great interest. She had already remembered that Su Lu was originally an extremely talented mechanic. Her earlier shock gradually faded, but at this moment, seeing the fanatical worship in the eyes of those mechanics, for some reason, a faint sense of pride actually grew in her heart. Yesterday, Su Lu had escaped for thousands of miles and returned to the mountain for a surprise attack. Su Lu had left an incomparably deep impression on this nation's girl, but it was very strange. At this moment, Su Lu was wearing a tight-fitting military singlet, sweating profusely and holding the repair arm like he was holding a large gun. This scene really did give birth to some indescribable emotions in her heart. His figure is quite good. Jian Shui'er looked at Su Lu, who was busy on the mech. Although not very muscular, the lines of his muscles were clearly defined, and subconsciously thought of this. Immediately, her cheeks reddened slightly, and she shrugged her shoulders in self-relief. The Black MX's damage was not too serious, but because Luoqiu Airport lacked most of the specialized parts, Su Lu could only use some common parts as replacements. This method of doing so would definitely cause the MX's combat power to decrease by a lot, but the fact that he could use those unimaginable ideas to make this Black MX stand up and run again was already very incredible. After a phase of the repair work was completed, the 6 mechanics officers left the warehouse. Su Lu wiped the sweat off his forehead, exhaled softly, and climbed down from the tall mech. He was very different from the average mechanic in the military. It was not because he understood this MX mech too well, but more because of the repair philosophy that Uncle Feng Yu had imparted to him back then. Whether it was a battleship or a mech, they were actually just tools used by humans, and were no different from household appliances. Adhering to this philosophy, Su Lu did not have any fear when repairing the mech. He dared to fill in any kind of random replacement equipment, whether it was self-cleaning equipment or household appliances. In any case, he only wanted this mech to be able to move. It had to be said that it was precisely because of this difference in philosophy, the perception of treating gold as dung, that Su Lu could do whatever he wanted without fear. As a result, the mechanic beside him was dumbfounded and worshipped him from head to toe. After climbing down from the mech, his body and face were full of black engine oil. Behind his hips hung heavy tools like a teenager, clanking and clanking, looking quite pathetic. Just at this moment he turned around and saw a head of purple hair. Jian Shui'er looked at him with a smile. In the spacious warehouse it seemed that some crisp sounds of metal clashing could be heard like wind chimes. You said that back then father liked to carry a lot of tools behind him. Was it like what you are doing now? More or less, Su Lu said with a smile. He subconsciously scratched his head. The black high-density mech on his hands was all over his face, smearing it black. Jian Shui'er covered her mouth and giggled. After a moment, she regained her composure and asked seriously, "Does the Ministry of Defense have a new mission for you?" "Not yet." Su Lu opened the workbench and began to arrange the tools. In a low voice he said, "But I think they definitely won't ask me to send you back to the capital ring again. No matter what mission the Ministry of Defense gives me, I still have to fix my MX first. After leaving this mech, there's actually not much I can do." Jian Shui'er was silent for a moment. She understood what Su Lu meant. Chapter 430. The Nutshell Engineering Department's first prototype MX mecha was silver-white in color, so it was called Little White Flower. This MX was black, so it was called Little Black Flower. It sounded natural, but there was really nothing new about it. Jian Shui'er found that Su Li's ability to come up with names was on a completely different level from the mecha repair ability he had displayed earlier, and the mecha control ability he had displayed last night. However, looking at this face full of black motor oil, Looking at that mouth of ridiculously white teeth, looking at that pair of eyes that were not big but appeared exceptionally clear and sincere, without a single trace of impurity, Jian Shuier narrowed her eyes. They were like the two crescent moons in the sky above the capital. She felt that at this moment he really did look like a little black flower. Using a classifier like flower, using a noun like flower to describe a man, especially such an ordinary-looking young man, made Jian Shuier feel slightly embarrassed when she woke up. Her eyes shifted slightly and she changed the topic. Pointing at the enormous black mecha behind Su Lu, she asked, "This MX has been modified? Otherwise, how could it be so powerful?" She shrugged a little embarrassedly and continued, "I only know that cars can be modified." This sounded a little like the stage of finding topics to talk about before a date, but Su Lu was slightly taken aback, and then replied earnestly and honestly, "There were some minor modifications, but as for how it differs from the fitted MX, if I didn't learn this, I really can't say for sure." This was the truth. In order to match Su Li's control characteristics, Shang Qiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department had decisively abandoned most of the long-range fire control system of the little black flower. It was difficult to avoid any loopholes in the mecha's assembly system. Other than characters like Su Lu and Madman Li, even the best ace pilots of the federal military would find it very difficult to get used to operating this little black flower. Some serious problems might even arise if they tried to operate it. Hearing this honest statement, Jian Shuier's expression was somewhat unnatural. She shrugged cutely and pursed her pink lips self-deprecatingly. She grew up in the lees of Philadelphia and was doted on by thousands of people at the age of 12. Such a background and experience gave her a sense of pride in the Federation. However, this kind of pride had always been hidden deep in her bones, and she would never show it in front of ordinary people. However, although Su Lu wasn't familiar with her, they had been together for such a long time. Furthermore, he was her biological father, so he couldn't be considered an ordinary person. From her point of view, Su Lu was clearly using the enhanced maneuver platform. Why did he have to hide it from her? He even said that it was some kind of simulation system. Now that he could not explain it clearly, the proud national girl naturally did not want to continue asking. "Yes, I thought you were still resting. You must have worked hard last night." Su Lu felt the change in Jian Shuier's mood. He nervously wiped the oil on his hands onto his overalls and asked. Jian Shuier came back to her senses. She didn't understand why she felt a little uneasy because of Su Li's concealment. She rubbed her hair a little angrily, raised her small face and spread out her hands and said, "There are some things I want to ask you." The two walked along the deep underground corridor and walked out of the warehouse. At this time, there were countless warships and military aircraft taking off at a high density in Luoqiu Airport. Most of the Federation soldiers were busy in a state of war, so no one paid attention to them. In the space, only the clear footsteps of the two people and the crisp sound of the wind chimes behind their butts could be heard. I always thought that I had been in Channel 23 for too long, so everyone felt close to me. The script of the TV series was well written, and the character of the female captain was very cute. Other than that, I am just a very ordinary person. Other than being a little good-looking, there is nothing to be proud of. Jian Shuier was draped in a light blue Federal Fleet officer's uniform, with a soft light gray thin jacket inside. Her hands were clasped in front of her body, and her picturesque eyebrows were slightly furrowed. The tenderness in front of the girl's chest was squeezed more clearly by her arms. Su Lu turned his head and looked at her. He was silent, but in his heart, he thought that for a girl to be as beautiful and moving as you, that was already her greatest strength. "I don't even know how to wear clothes. You used to mock me." Jian Shuier stopped in her tracks. She crossed her arms and tilted her head to look at him seriously. "I'm not even very competent as a celebrity." Su Lu thought of the concert stage last night. The girl's tight red dress that made the soldiers fall into a frenzy, and that dark uniform that couldn't be any shorter. He thought of the smoothness in the mecha and still remained silent, but in the depths of his heart, he whistled to express his amazement. "In any case, I think we should all be very clear that I'm not some big shot." Su Lu suddenly turned his head. The dim lights in the underground corridor shone on her beautiful face, making him suddenly have some strange thoughts. His eyes gradually narrowed, and he asked slowly, "What are you trying to say?" I don't understand. Jian Shui'er's eyes flashed with a puzzled but determined light. Why did the Department of Defense use me as bait? Why did the Empire's people really come after me? Can you understand? I can't. You're here too? Sulu looked at her and asked. Jian Shui'er lowered her gaze and said softly, "Don't forget, I'm also a soldier." This kind of feeling was a little strange. That night, after Sulu conducted the third assembly test on Little Black Flower, he dragged his tired body back to his room. During the day, he had already contacted Bai Yulan and found out that Group 7 had followed the mobile battalion back to the base camp that night. They would probably have to wait at least until the current phase of the war ended before they could reach Luochao spaceport by land. Unable to sleep in the middle of the night, Sulu laid on his bed with his hands behind his head. He watched the Federation's news on the television in a daze. The Federation Army's attack on Planet 5460 was going smoothly. The battle on the other two planets was as fierce as expected. With the Westwoods Military District as the main force, plus the 13 divisions of the 1st and 2nd Military District, a total of 73 divisions were all deployed on the two planets. However, under the crazy firepower of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, the Federation had only managed to establish 7 bases on the surface. And they had paid a terrible price for it. The images broadcast through the news were all very heroic. It seems that the Westwoods Tigers have really encountered a tough nut to crack this time. Although Sulu had never met the fierce man from the Zhong family, because of his wife and little watermelon, and because the man had stood up for him, he had a very inexplicable sense of closeness to him. Naturally, he didn't want anything to happen to this commander. As for the crazy war machine Madman Li, he wasn't worried at all. Chapter 431. In the days of the war, there were brave Federation soldiers dying every second, and the 3-star systems at the edge of the Westwoods had long been engulfed in blood and fire. The relevant government departments were definitely not stupid enough to allow the major TV stations to continuously publish the names of the fallen soldiers in black. On the contrary, the news was filled with victory reports and commendations that were constantly appearing on the news. And the name that appeared the most in these battle reports and commendations was the Federation's 3rd Military Region's 7th Mechanic Division. The war suddenly broke out, and the Federation's propaganda machine launched a simultaneous and intensive attack. In just a few days, the Iron 7 Division, which had been gradually forgotten by the public of the Federation, appeared in front of the entire universe with an unstoppable momentum. It had to be admitted that the performance of the Iron 7 Division in this victorious battle was definitely worthy of the glory that they were enjoying at this moment. On Planet 5460, the Imperial Expeditionary Force brazenly invaded the south, and the Federation's 3 lines of defense were on the verge of collapse. It was the Iron 7 Division's blockade at the front line of the Huangshanling Lonely Ridge that fired the first shot of the Federation's counterattack and set off a frenzied invasion of the north. This force completely annihilated the Imperial Moonwolf Group in the Mountain War Zone, and then immediately pursued the Imperial Assault Group, which had nearly 20,000 soldiers for thousands of miles. However, what the Federal Military and Division Commander Du Shaoqing did not expect was that the 2 Federation divisions that retreated from the south of the demarcation line did not arrive at the designated location at the designated time. However, the Imperial Assault Group had already regained their senses and launched a fierce counterattack on the Glacier Plateau, trying to nail the Iron 7 Division's pursuit to the Red Plateau soil. Du Shaoqing, wearing sunglasses, silently raised his right hand and pointed to the north like an arrow. The arrow was already on the string, and it had to be released. The Iron 7th Division was exhausted, but they were still silent and valiant. They charged toward the Imperial Assault Group, who were trying to regroup and organize a counterattack. The valiant soldiers of the Federation and the soldiers of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, whose willpower was tempered by ice and snow, once again clashed with each other on the Red Plateau. The formation that had just been formed was once again disrupted. The Iron 7th Division still coldly continued their crazy and fierce pursuit. This desperate chase lasted from late night to early morning, and from early morning to dusk. It was unknown how much blood was sprayed into the sky, making the sunset incomparably bewitching red that night. When the red clouds were as red as blood, the Iron Seven Masters obtained the final victory. However, they also paid an extremely disastrous price. The Imperial Expeditionary Force's strategy of defending and waiting for reinforcements, which had been maintained for decades, suddenly melted like ice and snow, just like the once every 3,000 years flow of this planet. The Maple Forest Alliance's many years of savings were all used up because of His Majesty's reckless order, and because of old General Ambry's ruthless and even somewhat desperate decision to leave his homeland. All of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's heavy weapons, secret land-based missile bases, electronically controlled micro-aircraft hangars, military deployments, and even the most real strength of the troops were all exposed in front of the Federal Army. With the Iron 7th Division's tragic victory as the starting point, the Federation began a rapid counterattack from the south to the north. Whether it was the command center, the West Woods Military District, or the Department of National Defense far away in the capital ring, none of them would let go of such a heaven-sent opportunity to plan for the results of this battle. The Federation had a total of nearly 3,400 M52 mechas, and more than 300 of them were thrown on the north-south border of this planet. Like countless cold iron protrusions, they mixed in with the automated mechanical troops and advanced towards the north. There were also dozens of strange black MX mechas appearing and disappearing in the mountains and wilderness. The Maple Forest Alliance retreated decisively like a tide, and the Federal Army chased after them fiercely like a forest fire. Until the planet turned into a sea of fire, the Imperial Expeditionary Force's Maple Forest Alliance was made up of 9 army brigades and 1 mecha brigade. Including the logistics and related officers in the base, they had a total of more than 218,000 people. When they retreated to the safe zone of mid-range missiles in the northern hemisphere that was covered in ice and snow, they had already left behind more than 60,000 corpses on the ground in the south. The Maple Forest Alliance took 17 mecha clans from the army brigades and took on the task of attacking on the front line. In the end, only 5 of them were able to retreat with their formation intact. What was more fatal was that under the attack of the Federation's air power and concentrated long-range missiles, it was very difficult for the Imperial armies to move their heavy firepower equipment into the warehouses hidden by the glaciers. The protracted battle was cut in half at the waist, and it was very difficult for them to continue. The plan of the Federation's Ministry of Defense was 1/3 complete, and the Imperial Expeditionary Force was holed up in the ice and snow of the Northern Hemisphere, without any signs of life. At this point, the general situation of Planet 5460 was set. The military commander of the Empire, Old General Ambly, was not inferior to his counterparts in the Federation. In fact, he did not make a mistake. Although he did not think that this was a trap set by the Federation in the beginning, he was prepared to break the trap. However, he did not expect that the Federation would silently send another black noose into this big trap. As the saying goes, a big ring encircles a small ring. The old general of the Empire lost because of the source, because of His Majesty the Emperor's random order. Old General Ambly's old face was as cold as the ice and snow around him. His sparse eyebrows were mixed with ice shards as he stood on the top floor of the base covered in ice and snow. His old hands continuously patted the steel railings, and his heart was filled with endless emotions and shock. How could the Federation have guessed His Majesty the Emperor's random order? Or could it be that the Federation spies had unbelievably infiltrated the core of the Empire? Unlike the fireworks of the victory of Planet 5460, the remaining 2/3 of the Ministry of Defense's plan did not go so smoothly. The main fleet of the Federation had to be stationed at the Gary Corridor and the Night Scorpion Nebula. Even if they had to wait for 100,000 years, they had to be on guard against the appearance of the Imperial fleet. That was the scenario that the Federation feared the most. The Ministry of Defense's plan was to use Jian Shui'er as bait to ignite a local war, then use the local war to trigger a planetary war. Using this planetary war, they would then use this planetary war to lure the only fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force to leave the barren star field. Once the Imperial fleet was lured away, the Ministry of Defense would then secretly prepare for a large-scale landing on the other 2 fallen planets. They would be able to obtain the precious and safe outer space environment. There was nothing wrong with this plan, except that the Federation did not expect that old General Ambly would directly use the Federation's plan to start a tragic planetary war. Except that they did not expect that the Imperial Expeditionary Force would actually spend decades to set up such dense and violent stratospheric firepower on the two fallen planets. On these two planets at the border of the Silan region, although the Federation's offensive could not be said to be gloomy, it had sunk into a kind of chilling stalemate. Every moment, there were countless Silan native soldiers whose names were marked with black boxes, signifying their death on the news. The Senate had just passed an order of commendation for the Iron 7th Division. At the same time, the commanders of the two divisions that delayed the military flight were immediately removed from their posts and sent back to the Capital Ring Military Court for trial. Sulu narrowed his eyes, then turned off the TV and began to think about some problems with his eyes closed. The two divisions were directly under the command of the Westwoods Military Command. The Iron 7th Division was constantly on the news and receiving commendations. Sulu did not find it strange. Although the troops led by Du Shaoqing were the first to go to the front lines, they had displayed a fierce iron will and outstanding military service, so it was natural for them to receive commendations. The problem was that the two fallen planets of the Westwoods Military Command that were the main offensive force were unable to break through the situation. Thinking of the rumors that Zhong Laohu of the Westwoods had been suppressing Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division, and the two Westwoods commanders who were arrested, Sulu felt a little strange and thought about it. Although the son of the Zhong family in the Westwoods was really stupid, and those powerful relatives of the Zhong family were really annoying, Sulu still sat on the side of the Westwoods Zhong family because that was the home of Little Watermelon and Mrs. Zhong. Sulu fell into a deep sleep as he thought about this without a clue. Outside the spaceport from time to time, the roar of battleships taking off and landing, the noisy sound of engines exploding, and the orderly and solemn footsteps of soldiers could not wake him up, because this was a beautiful dream. However, when he turned around, he saw a young girl in a white dress standing by the window. The light from the sun shone in through the window, illuminating the young girl's youthful body and revealing her curves. What moved his heart the most was the pair of slender, tight, and smooth legs that did not match her height. They were somewhat exaggerated. The girl did not answer, but in the dream, Sulu knew who she was because she had short purple hair. Sulu felt that he was blaspheming an artist's oil painting. He reluctantly turned his head back, but he saw that the Shangqiu under him had become the beautiful daughter of the Nan family. Nan Xiangmei, who was being pressed down by his strong body, was wearing a dark blue turtleneck imitation sweater. Her eyes were closed tightly, and her black eyelashes were slightly trembling. She seemed to be awake but refused to open her eyes, as if she was expecting something. Her cheeks were full of shyness, and there was a touch of purity in her gentleness. However, in front of this purity, he was a little violent and excited. He grabbed the hem of the dark blue sweater and pulled it up, exposing Nan Xiangmei's white jade-like upper body to the air. Sulu only felt that it was warm and soft, and the fine particles on her creamy skin were shivering. It seemed that the air was a little cold. A little cold? It was indeed a little cold in the gatehouse, and the pear garden outside the window was still snowing. He looked up in excitement and confusion and saw the pair of black-rimmed glasses. However, the pair of eyes under the glasses did not have any sense of righteousness, only incomparably seductive and pure. The girl was also wearing a pair of red devil horns on her head, like a clumsy elf imitating a little goblin. Sulu, who was sweating all over, suddenly woke up. He sat on the bed in a daze for a long time, and looked at his hands in a daze. Then he walked into the bathroom dejectedly, turned on the tap and began to wash his clothes. Chapter 432. Drying his wet underwear on the heater rack, he turned on the switch and let the cold water droplets fall from the sky. Sulu rubbed his skin hard until his back was red. He took a longer shower than usual. In the cold water, he raised his hands in front of his eyes in a daze. Looking at the white skin on his fingertips, he thought to himself that his hands should be used to operate a mecha. Although a mecha could indeed shoot down a plane, he didn't understand why he had this wet dream. Thinking about the romantic fantasy that flashed through his mind a few days ago, he couldn't help but be shocked at how much his moral standards had dropped while the level of testosterone in his body had increased too much. However, he completely didn't realize that in reality, The war and death on this planet itself was a supreme weapon that stimulated lust and shattered all spiritual rules. Holding the cold porcelain basin with both hands, he looked at the somewhat unfamiliar young face in the mirror. There was no steam in the bathroom, so there was no fog on the mirror. He didn't need to use his hands to wipe it away, but why did that face look so unfamiliar? The straight eyebrows were still resting peacefully above his eyes, like two unsheathed flying knives. The fine hair between his eyebrows hadn't been shaved for a long time. The two thick black lines seemed to connect together, but there was no sense of valiance. Matched with the pair of small eyes below, it made people feel that this face was very trustworthy. But it was still unfamiliar because that pair of eyes seemed too calm. Sulu looked at himself in the mirror and thought about a few years ago, after he scared off that person on Donglin's Clock Tower Street. He had also been silent and nervous in the bathroom mirror. That person was called Bao Long Tao, right? How come he was almost forgetting his name? Sulu found that after he escaped from Donglin, he had become more and more silent and calm. However, this silence and calm to him was somewhat similar to an undesirable aura. He didn't think this was his nature, and he didn't like this kind of outward change, so he stared at himself in the mirror in a daze. He didn't understand what the Federation's plan was. Jian Shuier said that the Westwoods military's main attack on the two fallen stars was very difficult, and that the days of the Zhong family's tiger were very difficult, but he didn't understand. He didn't understand the Empire's ferocious attacks and the resolute retreat, nor did he understand the Federation's meticulous and wondrous military arrangements, nor did he understand the art of war command. At the end of the day, he was just an insignificant character in the Grand Galactic War. He could only silently turn back to repair his mecha, and then travel through the forest at high speed. This was his greatest reliance. However, he had already begun to kill his enemies. Those Imperial mecha that had exploded in front of him and behind him. Those corpses that had died with their eyes wide open. Their twisted bodies constantly stimulating his brain. When he was in Eastwood, he had no knowledge of the people of the Empire. It was only when he saw the black tombstones on the graveyard in Macklin that he had a direct understanding of the people of the Empire. Sulu had killed a lot of people. When he was a child, blood dripped from the tip of the hydraulic pipe in the garbage dump, a gun barrel in the underground parking lot of Lin High, and corpses were everywhere in the Foundation building. He was a good person, and good people could kill without blinking, let alone someone from the Empire. However, it was too easy for people to die on the battlefield. Life was too cheap here. In the middle of the night, Sulu, who was hit hard by the atmosphere of war, felt a little lost in his youthful state. He walked out of his room and listened to the chaotic and nervous noises outside the spaceport. He silently lowered his head and walked towards the end of the quiet corridor. Little Black Flower's mecha was quietly waiting on the other end. In the cold, dangerous, and complicated web of war, no matter how strong an individual's strength was, they were just an insect that was stuck in the web. They could be swallowed up at any moment. There was no chance of survival. He had to repair his personal MX. That way, he would have an extra set of armor and a few more sharp knives. When he struggled in the web in the future, he would be able to make a bigger commotion. There was a military satellite phone in the quiet corridor. Sulu silently thought for a moment. He turned his head, picked up the phone terminal scanner, and placed it behind his neck to scan it. After passing the authorization, he pressed a string of numbers. It was Shi Qinghai's phone call. The call was picked up very quickly. From this detail, Sulu knew that he had already arrived in the West Woods. His mood couldn't help but become heavier. "How's your job as a liaison officer?" Sulu leaned against the cold wall and smiled at his friend on the other end of the phone. "The overall situation here is not a problem, but there are still some dangers. But the Department of Defense hasn't sent any orders, so I'm just waiting for death in the spaceport." Shi Qinghai's bright and charming laughter came from the other end of the phone. Sulu smiled and began to talk about his feelings when he was on a battlefield for the first time. His tone was slightly heavy and worried. The war between the Federation and the Imperium was like a fight between two rock giants. Every heavy punch might not hurt the other party, but the falling pieces of rocks would definitely kill the other party. After a short pause, Sulu thought of the dream he had. His cheeks were slightly hot as he talked about it. Then he nervously asked in a hoarse voice, "Should I be in a relationship?" But how can I like 4 people at the same time? Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone suddenly asked, have you been stimulated by a woman recently? Sulu shook his head. Strangely, Shi Qinghai on the other side of the planet seemed to have seen his movement. He said in a slightly mocking tone, although I'm busy now, I still watch the news. The scandal between you and that national girl is so big. Although you're wearing a pair of toad sunglasses, do you think you can hide it from my lightning-like eyes? Sulu was silent. Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone was silent for a while. Then he said seriously, I think you should find a woman. Sulu replied, don't they mean the same thing? Falling in love doesn't mean that you can sleep with her, but you might have to get married. You definitely won't get married, but you definitely have to sleep with her. Shi Qinghai said sarcastically, these are 2 very different things. You mean eventing? Sulu held the phone and lowered his voice. Is this really that interesting? If it's not interesting, then why are you dreaming? I'm just asking. Why are you so angry? Sulu was a little annoyed. He looked at the remaining time on the phone and suddenly said seriously, you have to take care of yourself. The anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain were officially part of the government forces. They came to the front line of the West Woods to fight. Presumably, these soldiers would join the battlefield after some time. Sulu was very clear that there would be a lot of dangerous and complicated compromises and exploitation. Shi Qinghai's role as a liaison officer was very dangerous. Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone was silent for a while. Then he said, you also take care of yourself. Overly high-profile morality can only cultivate hypocrites. In my opinion, although our young leader has never put the word morality on his lips, he has always put it above his head. And he can't wait for everyone to see. Is this a big lie that looks real? Or is it real gold and silver? The flames of war had spread to the glacier forest in the northern hemisphere. The long-range firepower of the Imperial Expeditionary Force was suppressed to the brink of collapse. This road that passed by the front line of the Huangshanling Lonely Ridge returned to silence. At this moment, a motorcade composed of dozens of military and civilian vehicles slowly drove over. The roaring sound of the engines broke the silence. In the back of a military vehicle, these extremely sarcastic words were even more harsh than the sound of the engines. Bai Yulan lowered her head and dozed off. She couldn't stop Lan Xiaolong from nagging. Her delicate eyebrows couldn't help but furrow. Lan Xiaolong was smoking a cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the blackened sparks on the mountain outside the window. He looked at the scattered metal wreckage and secretly assessed the extent of the battle that happened that night. His lips moved, but he didn't stop his sarcastic remarks. That old man is good. He took the nation's girl and ran away. He saved that camp. Isn't it cool? Isn't it glorious? But what about us? We didn't fire a single shot when we went to the front line. Although we didn't become deserters, we became leftovers and were thrown back to the headquarters by him. The cigarette on Lan Xiaolong's lips swayed up and down. He looked very interesting. The sarcastic expression on his face was full of sarcasm. The 7th Combat Team didn't fight a single battle. They're about to be transferred back to the West Woods. Speaking of which, all the battles were fought by our supervisor alone. Of course, we can only follow behind him and watch the show. What are we doing here? Traveling? In the carriage, Xiong Linquan had been carefully maintaining the heavy rotary machine gun. When he heard Lan Xiaolong's words, his face became a little ugly. The rest of the soldiers of the 7th Combat Team felt the same. Of course, they didn't have any opinions about Supervisor Su Lu. They just thought that since the war had started, they, who were originally very fierce, couldn't do anything because they had an even fiercer supervisor. It was really a little frustrating. You're not originally a member of the 7th Combat Team. Bai Yulan finally spoke softly. I don't understand why the division sent you here. Lan Xiaolong threw the cigarette out of the window. The cigarette landed on the charred platform of the grenade launcher, creating a small spark. He said, of course, it's to protect the Federation's treasure, our Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. Bai Yulan frowned. Damn it, how could they send a major to protect a lieutenant colonel? Furthermore, this guy's military skills were quite average. However, he had been in the port city's 83-84 unit for many years, so his military style was quite obvious. Lan Xiaolong ignored him and said to the men of the 7th Combat Team who had their heads lowered, "Our supervisor is on a mecha. Of course we can't follow, but you have to think about it. He's already a lieutenant colonel. He can't be using a MX to pretend to be a soldier and kill everywhere. In the West Woods, in the Empire, in the mountains, in the grasslands, constantly killing in and out, playing the hero 7 times in and out, and finally dying of exhaustion and walking to the end of the road? Bullshit. He has to be the commanding officer of the unit, like a regiment commander or division commander." However, we all know that although that guy has been studying commanding teaching materials every day for the past few months, when it comes to commanding he doesn't have much of a future. He's a few thousand streets behind someone like Du Shaoqing. When the time comes, what do you think we can do for him? Gu Shifeng, Lu Jiao, Xiong Linquan, you all need to think about it carefully. Lan Xiaolong was like a hooligan as he gestured around. Su Lu, wearing sunglasses, stood by the wide porthole and narrowed his eyes to look at the colorful planet floating in the black universe. Thinking of the smoke of war and the soldiers who died on the battlefield that night, he slightly pursed his lips and believed that he would be back soon. Magnolia walked behind him and handed him a cup of freshly brewed green tea. She said softly, "I just received the order from the company to escort Miss Jian Shui to the main planet of the West Woods. Then, the 7th Combat Team will rest here and wait for the next mission." Whatever he thought of, it came. Su Lu took the teacup, thanked her and smiled bitterly. He was about to say goodbye to Jian Shui, and the real battlefield in the stars was waiting for him and the men of the 7th Combat Team. The indicator light above the porthole rang, and the deck of the hull was ready to close. The light warship began to accelerate in preparation for entering the twisting passage of the Huiming corridor. The flowing light outside the window was pulled into a strange light circle like leaves. Su Lu retracted his gaze and looked down at the green leaves floating in the green tea in the glass. He was Silent Sunset State, the main planet of the West Woods, Changfeng Military Base. Countless spacious landing platforms were densely packed in the wilderness like lakes. The warship that the Victory Concert Team took when they first arrived in the West Woods was docked in the Changfeng Military Base. However, the base today was much more tense and busy than before. The war had begun, and countless weapons, ammunition and resources sent from the capital ring had to be transported to the front line through this largest military base. Su Lu still wore his sunglasses and stood behind Jian Shui, vigilantly looking around. His gaze swept past her shoulder and looked at the fleet that was driving out from under the warship, especially the black car that belonged to him. Today they would be staying at the Venus Hotel for the night. Then Jian Shui and her team would return to the capital ring, and the two sides would officially separate. Su Lu did not have too many feelings of sadness in his heart. Because of the uncle, there were too many stories that needed to be told between them, and too many unknown possibilities. Her bright purple hair was as smooth as silk. Jian Shui looked ahead calmly. She didn't turn her head, but she knew that the man behind her was looking at her from the corner of his eyes. She thought about how he was her father's only student and the blind date arranged by her family. She thought about how he had watched her grow up and how he knew her age, birthday, and even her private data. She wanted to laugh, but her beautiful cheeks blushed, just as she was about to turn around and have a serious conversation with this very interesting guy. A bouquet of very bright roses came to her and interrupted some of the inexplicable emotions that had just arisen. The Zhong family of the West Woods indeed had an unimaginable power and status in this region. Zhong Ziki, the nephew of Commander Zhong who was deeply doted on, could easily enter the security area of the military base at such a tense time of war. "I have a pass." Zhong Ziki, who was holding the bouquet of flowers, did not say anything to Jian Shui, who had a slightly stunned expression. Instead, he said to Su Lu, who was behind her, "You have a bright future ahead of you. I don't want to offend the person favored by the old man, but I'm just here to give you a bouquet of flowers, so I'm sure you won't mind." As soon as the Zhong family's fleet appeared in sight, the armed members of Group 7 had already prepared security measures. However, Su Lu did not say anything, so everyone remained calm. Zhong Ziki looked at Su Lu and said, Last time at the hotel, Madmanly already helped you regain your dignity. This time, I've decided not to give you any chance to slap my face. These words were said very sincerely. Ever since he found out about Su Li's background, Zhong Ziqi had already given up on the thought of seeking revenge on him within a short period of time. However, when he saw the rumors about Su Lu and Jian Shui spreading like wildfire on the news, he felt as if his heart had been stabbed 300 times with a knife and 2 jars of sea salt had been needed. It was so unbearable that he couldn't say it out loud. Therefore, he came with sincerity and grace today. I want to compete with you fairly. Zhong Ziqi smiled. His face could be considered handsome, but because of his slightly wrinkled nose, he looked a little repulsive. He only knew that Su Lu was a person he could not afford to offend, but he did not know Jian Shui's background. He said gently and politely, Miss Jian Shui, please accept my flowers, and please don't misunderstand that I am harassing you. You must know that Master Schiller once said, I love you, what does it have to do with you? Jian Shui playfully raised her eyebrows, looked at Zhong Ziqi in front of her, and asked, Are you sure you love me? Zhong Ziqi's brows furrowed. After thinking for a long time he said, I can't say that now. In the past I only felt that you were a treasure, and it would definitely feel good to have you in my arms. But now I like you with respect. From these words, it could be seen that the secret of the Federation's Department of Defense's successful military operation had not been hidden from this young master of the Zhong family. Now that he admitted that he did not love her, the anger in Jian Shui's heart subsided a little. The girl smiled sweetly and said, Since it has nothing to do with me, then what does it have to do with me? At this time the black car silently slid to the side of the group. Lan Xiaolong pushed open the driver's door and walked behind Su Lu. With a trace of mischief, he said softly, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, I've always thought that you should learn how to be jealous and act like a spoiled brat. Seeing that he did not respond, Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said to Bai Yulan and the others behind him, If he doesn't know how to do it, then you should help him. Bai Yulan lowered her head, thinking to herself, We're soldiers, not henchmen who are going to kidnap innocent women for the young master. At this time Jian Shui very seriously said to Zhong Ziqi, I allow you to secretly like me from afar, as long as you don't let me know. These words were said very calmly and indifferently, but there was a very subtle and very sharp mockery in them. Zhong Ziqi's face gradually turned pale. Although he did not act out because of Su Lu behind the national girl, the anger in his heart would probably continue to burn for a very, very long time. Su Lu had been silent because he was thinking. Looking at the countless battleships and transport ships that frequently took off and landed in the Chongfeng base through the lens of his sunglasses, he naturally thought of the smoke and blood on planet 5460, and the tragic landing battle on the 2 fallen planets. At such a time of war, people like Zhong Ziqi actually had the leisure to play the drama of jealousy and chasing after celebrities. At this time, under the battleship, a few minutes of tit-for-tat fighting, there were probably many Federation soldiers on the front line who had fallen on the battlefield and could never stand up again. This strong contrast made his mood a little heavy and annoyed. Was he going to play the kind of drama where you don't know who my backer is, so I bully you? I just watch with a smile, then I use my backer to bully you back. Then a bystander will pull out an even more powerful backer to bully everyone and have fun? This was a good way to pass the time and lengthen the length of the boring story in his boring life. However, he was not willing to live such a life. The reason why the leaders of the 1,000-year-old families in the capital ring did not want him to come out of the Black Dungeon, and why they were so wary of this lone figure was none other than the fact that he dared to kill. He could kill. Clearly, this world had not forced him to the extreme, but he dared to kill without reason. After hearing this threat, Zhong Ziqi, whose expression had changed drastically due to anger, suddenly turned pale. This was because he knew that Su Lu would definitely do what he said. Even those powerful bodyguards from the Westwoods Military Special Battalion who were silent behind him could not help but change their expressions when they thought of the deeds that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu had done. They carefully and cautiously approached Zhong Ziqi. A strange blush appeared on Zhong Ziqi's pale face. He stared at Su Lu beside the black car and said, Good, good, good. But I have to remind you of one thing. This is the West Woods. This is not a world where you can make a living with your fists. I have already given you enough face, he said in a deep voice. Since you are not willing to give me back my face, then I will also put my words here. As long as she is still in the West Woods, I will pursue her. If you think this is harassment, you can come and beat me. When he said this, Zhong Ziqi did not back down. He took 2 steps toward the black car and said mockingly, "In fact, I am going to continue to harass you. I want to know how you will beat me." The black-clothed bodyguards behind him also walked up, vigilantly watching the combatants of Group 7 around them. A few of them had already reached their hands into their black suits. Their movements were very natural and relaxed, as if they were reaching for a cigarette. Everyone present knew that these people were definitely not touching cigarettes but sharp killing weapons. However, they did not deliberately hide it. They just did it expressionlessly. A strong enough deterrent force gushed out from the simple action of reaching into their clothes. The Federation strictly controlled firearms. Except for local tyrants or warlords like the Zhong family in the West Woods, who would dare to openly use guns in the military base? Everyone in Group 7 had a solemn expression. They stared at these experienced professional soldiers and silently waited for the follow-up development. Zhong Ziqi's confidence was based on this. Although he was angry, it was impossible for him to openly mobilize 2 battalions to kill Su Lu on the spot. However, the fierce character that grew up in the military compound made him have the impulse to pull out a gun in front of Su Lu. He looked at Su Lu coldly. His expression seemed to say, "Come and beat me, come and beat me." It was not Su Li's fist that came, but a delicate military knife. A delicate hand gently held the streamlined knife handle made of black fragrant wood as if it was holding a flower. Suddenly, it cut the air of Chongfeng Base, which was full of the sound of wind, and brought a more shrill wind sound. With a sound, the blade flashed and cut the flower petals in front of Zhong Ziqi. Then the blade twisted, and gently rested on his throat like lightning. What a fast blade! The faces of the bodyguards of the Zhong family in the West Woods changed dramatically. They pulled out their pistols with a jaw-dropping speed and aimed at the person holding the knife. However, they did not pull the trigger, because the delicate knife had been quietly placed on the artery of Zhong Ziqi's neck, and it did not tremble at all. The blade was very stable, and not trembling at all was actually scarier than not trembling at all. The chopped red flower petals rustled and fell down. The sound of guns being loaded rang out all around them. The clear sound was mixed with endless solemnity. The men of Group 7 had already raised the Qian light machine guns in their hands and coldly surrounded the bodyguards of the Zhong family. The barrels of the guns were pitch black, revealing a chilling killing intent. What was more terrifying was the buzzing sound. Xiong Linquan stood outside the crowd, and his 2 muscular arms were holding a heavy Carlin rotary cannon, aiming at all the people of the Zhong family. Bai Yulan's right hand gripped the delicate knife, while her left hand gently brushed away the strands of black hair in front of her eyes. She looked at the Zhong family's bodyguards who were aiming their guns at her and said softly, "At least for now we have more guns. I advise you to put down your guns." Group 7 was equipped with heavy firepower used on the battlefield. With a casual round of bullets, these well-trained professional soldiers of the Zhong family could only end up in a pool of blood. Zhong Ziqi's face was pale, and he raised his head without saying a word. Since the death of his father, his head had always been held high, never falling. But at that time it represented his dignity and the glory of his family. But now it represented humiliation and fear. The fear came from the cold and delicate knife on his neck, from the sound of guns being loaded, and from the high-speed rotation of Dalin's soul. He couldn't understand. These mercenaries clearly knew who he was. Why did they still dare to raise their guns? He couldn't understand why did this quiet man in front of him, who looked like a girl, dare to point a sharp knife at his vitals. "Kill me if you have the guts. We are carrying out a military mission. If you continue to harass Miss Jian Shuer, I will kill you with my own hands." Bai Yulan deepened Su Li's previous threat. He quietly looked at Zhong Ziqi's pale face, and after saying this, he didn't speak again. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that Su Lu had already closed the door. This delicate man's lips curled up into 2 beautiful arcs, and his fingers slightly tightened. A streak of blood appeared on Zhong Ziqi's fair neck. The blood vessels that had appeared on the surface of his skin due to his anger and fear were immediately forced back under the skin by the cold and pain. His legs were somewhat weak, and his lips were sore and numb. He was simply unable to say anything. Bai Yulan slowly put away the knife and put it back into his pocket. He didn't even look at the Zhong family soldier who was pointing a gun at his forehead. He gently reached out his hand and pulled the gun away, and then walked back to his military vehicle. What a good show! Lan Xiaolong smiled as he looked at this scene. He thought that the guys from Group 7 finally understood what kind of formation they had to put on in order to stand up for their boss. And those big shots from the Department of National Defense would definitely like this slightly cliché show. Retreat. He calmed himself down and smiled as he saluted Zhong Ziqi. He waved his hand and signaled the members of Group 7 who were holding numerous large guns ready to fire at any time to leave. The smoke and dust dispersed in the wind. Zhong Ziqi covered his neck and stared blankly at the convoy that was leaving. His face was pale as he thought of those men holding guns, and the knife that was on his neck. He could clearly feel that if there was a conflict earlier, that knife would have really cut open his carotid artery, and those Qian machine guns and Dailings would have really dared to open fire. Countless small cold beads appeared on young Master Zhong's back, and he couldn't help but shiver. The original anger and vengeance in his heart was shattered by that cold feeling. In the shocked eyes of the crowd, the national girl turned around and walked into the crowd. The crowd naturally separated to form a passage. Wearing a light-colored windbreaker, she walked to the front of Su Lu and gently hugged his stiff body. She gently pressed her face against his chest and said with a smile and a voice that only the two of them could hear, "Don't forget that we are on a blind date. I have to explain to the Feiqing family." The reporters and the crowd looked at this scene in disbelief. In an instant, someone reacted and shouted, "It's Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. So he was hiding here." Su Lu lowered his head and quickly took out a pair of sunglasses and put them on his face. However, in the next moment, countless flashes lit up around him. It was like countless suns trying to evaporate every drop of water in his body that was as stiff as a rock at this time. Jian Shuer smiled and hugged him. She leaned on him and said softly, "Bear with it. The next time we meet again, maybe I will already be a reporter." Su Lu was stunned. He looked down at the beautiful face of the girl in his arms and couldn't speak. "Help me take care of Li Feng on the front line." Jian Shuer stood up straight and gently held his hand. She looked at him and said seriously, "My nephew is very pitiful." At this time, Su Lu could no longer hear the questions of the reporters around him. There was no flash in his eyes, only the beautiful face in front of him. His face was extremely stiff and was even about to twitch. Chapter 436. Just like in the legends, he went to the front lines at the age of 12, piloting a mecha and starting a blood-soaked game. He slaughtered more than 100 ace mecha pilots at the edge of the Bermuda Triangle and the outskirts of the space passage, earning himself the reputation of being invincible in the military. His personality was violent and arrogant to the extreme. With his solid battle results, he was promoted to become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the history of the Federation. Su Lu really could not understand what Madman Li had to take care of. What was so pitiful about him? This question perplexed him all the way until he took a bath. Dense droplets of water sprayed down from his head and face, but it was unable to wash away his doubts. This was because he knew that Jian Shuai was not as lovable and cute as she appeared on the surface. Every word that the young girl said naturally had its own reason. He turned on the tap, picked up the towel, and rubbed his face forcefully twice. He rubbed his face until it was slightly red. He raised his head to look at the bathroom and confirmed that there should not be any surveillance equipment here. So he slowly closed his eyes, lowered his body slightly, and squatted into a standard horse stance. In the midst of the fog, He began the practice that he had long been accustomed to. The tremors at the edge of the Eastwood mine had already pierced into his skin. No one could see the strange traces under his tight skin. Only he could feel the clear burning lines slowly moving along those lines that he did not understand. They squeezed out energy from the friction between every pair of muscle fibers and even every cell wall, gradually spreading to every part of his body. In the hot fog, Sulu closed his eyes tightly and took a deep breath. He used his biological clock to confirm that the time for the horse stance was up. His right foot left the ground and placed behind his left knee like a sheathed sword. At the same time, his two hands left his body and spread to the sides, forming a W-like shape. The center of gravity of his entire body was placed on his left foot. However, his movements were so natural and casual. The muscle lines under his skin were faintly discernible, hard and elastic. After maintaining this posture for 5 minutes, he changed his posture. He put his head down, his right hand on the wet ground, his left knee slightly bent, his left hand bent behind his back to support his waist. At the same time, he lifted his right foot back, and his entire body became a straight line. This posture looked very normal, but to maintain it for a long time was exceptionally difficult. After another 5 minutes, Sulu began to change his posture again. Sulu completed the 10 postures that he had learned when he was a teenager one by one, without a second of delay. Every movement was done to the extreme according to the uncle's requirements. The muscles and meridians in his body were twisted to the limit that the human body could bear. Back then, it was a huge problem for him to complete these 10 strange postures beside the mine. However, after so many years, these postures had become a part of his body's instinct, and they were exceptionally smooth and natural to him. After completing the 10 postures, he lightly exhaled a mouthful of foul air, and besides feeling slightly sore and numb from head to toe, he felt a wisp of refreshing and natural feeling. Sulu looked at his blurry face in the mirror and scratched his head. Suddenly, a trace of worry appeared on his thick black eyebrows. He did not know if there were geniuses in this universe, but at least he knew very well that so-called geniuses were just hard work that exceeded what normal people could bear. Since he was very young, as long as time allowed, he had never stopped practicing these 10 postures. Being able to have the personal strength that shocked the 7 great families, being able to use the simulation system to control a military mecha and kill everywhere, was actually all due to his silent and determined daily training. However, this time the battle on planet 5460, the weakness and hunger in his body at the end of the battle reminded Sulu of the many times he had risked his life to kill. He found that his ability had a very difficult flaw to solve. That was, every time he relied on the strange power in his body to split mountains and cut seas, his strength would drain very quickly. As a result, he would only shine for a moment before finally falling into a predicament where he could not continue. This was not difficult to explain. As a mechanical engineer who believed in scientific principles, although Sulu could not explain those mysterious abilities that the uncle had taught him, he could easily explain this phenomenon. Energy was always balanced. In an extremely short period of time, he had exploded with an extremely large amount of strength, or rather energy, then his body would definitely quickly fall into a weakened state. In normal life, jealousy, fighting, causing trouble, and killing people was not a big problem. At most, he would just roll up his sleeves or take off his clothes to have a good time, and then ignore it afterwards. However, now that he was on the front lines of the West Woods, facing those cruel and terrifying Imperial soldiers, this problem was a bit of a headache. He could not just insta-kill several mecha on the battlefield and then wait to be beaten to death, or wait awkwardly for his subordinates or allies to come to his rescue. How could he solve this problem? Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at his slightly pale self in the mirror, unable to find any answers. Perhaps he could go and ask that old master, or perhaps Li Feng, and perhaps he could find the root of the uncle's strange ability. However, the old master was too high up in the hierarchy, and Madman Li did not have a good impression of himself. Because at the entrance of the warehouse, a group of military officers was walking in. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu? A major general wearing the uniform of the Westwoods military looked warmly at the young man in the mecha. Sulu nodded. Because of your outstanding performance during the victorious military operation, The Department of Defense has awarded you the Purple Gold Medal Level 2. The Major General took out a medal from the box of his subordinate beside him and smiled at him, who had just climbed down from the mecha. He lowered his voice and said, "You also know that this is a secret operation, so the award can only be done in secret." Sulu lowered his head and looked at the glittering medal on the left side of his military uniform. He silently thought that he had already received a Purple Star Medal, the highest grade Purple Dawn Medal, and now he had received a Purple Gold Medal. However, besides the lowest grade Purple Star, it seemed that the rest of the medals could only be left at home to admire. This situation was a little unpleasant. As if guessing what he was thinking, the Major General of the Westwoods military reminded him, "At least on the surface of your exclusive mecha, you can paint 10 gold stars." Destroying an Empire mecha was equivalent to painting a gold star. This was the greatest glory of the Federation's mecha warriors. Sulu was slightly stunned, and then he realized that his battle record on 5460 had already been confirmed by the Department of Defense. Before he could say anything, Bai Yulan, who was standing at the foot of the mecha behind him, had already thrown away the cigarette in her mouth. She smiled and raised the blowtorch in her hand, and began to carefully and attentively paint the gold stars one by one. Perhaps at the same time, on the front line of the faraway Westwoods, on the fallen administrative planet filled with black fog and sky full of anti-aircraft artillery fire, between the mournful forest and the wild wilderness, on the rocky mountain in front of the largest landing base built by the Federal Army, the latest model of the Federation's Black MX was slowly retracting its blood-stained alloy chain knife. The base had just repelled a wave of the Empire's ferocious assault, and countless soldiers were staring at the Black MX with fervent and worshipful gazes. This was because in the previous battle, this MX had ruthlessly and incomparably destroyed 11 Empire's mechs. Chapter 437. Most of the Federal Fleet's landing force came from the Westwoods Military District. The first 3 divisions that landed were supported by the extravagant laser cannons of the space battleships. After paying a heavy price of thousands of Federation soldiers, they finally managed to hold off the crazy attacks of the Imperial Expeditionary Force on the surface of the planet. Panting heavily, they found a place to rest. The Federal Army had built 7 landing bases in the hills southeast of the planet. The Imperial armies would never allow these 7 landing bases to blossom like plum blossoms on their abdomen. Otherwise, when the main force of the Federation waiting coldly in space used these landing bases to land on the surface of the planet, the isolated Imperial Expeditionary Force would definitely meet with failure. Therefore, in these few days, these 7 landing bases received unimaginable and terrifying attacks. The Westwoods transport ships that forcibly landed in the face of the Empire's missiles continuously replenished their soldiers and weapons. However, even so, they could not keep up with the rate of casualties of the Federal Army. The Empire's Moonwolf 3rd generation mechas covered the hills and plains. The whistling of the mid-range missiles covered the sun. The 7 landing bases of the Federation were repaired and destroyed and repaired again. Death and rebirth, blood and corpses. The natural hills surrounding the bases were shaved off by the Empire's firepower. It was obvious how intense the war was. The Chalene base looked very simple. The steel fortress built by the 47 giant engineering mechas was damaged and burnt everywhere. Even with continuous repairs, it was still impossible to make every part of the fortress in perfect condition. This place was at the forefront of the 7 landing bases, receiving the most powerful attacks of the Imperial armies. In just 10 days, the soldiers' losses had reached a terrifying 40%. There were many times when the Empire's mecha groups had already broken into the base. Just as they were about to lose, they had a chance to catch their breaths because of the fleet's main cannons in space. There were 17 giant deep holes in front of the base. After the molten magma solidified, they became densely woven lines. They were still steaming in the cold evening air. These were the traces left behind by the main cannons of the Federation's battleships. The Empire's Black Sang Alliance's Mecha Brigade has retreated. It is estimated that they will attack again in an hour. A Westwood staff officer stared at the display on the radar and reported loudly. The commanding officer of the base had the rank of Major General on his shoulder. In reality, it was rare for a general to be at the front line, especially at a front line like the Chilean base. However, he had no choice but to come. The Federal Army and the Imperial Expeditionary Force both knew what the 7 plum blossom-like landing bases meant. The commander was already outside the atmosphere of 3,320, and was looking at him coldly from the battleship. As a general, he had to be at the front line, the very front line. He did not know how long the main cannons of the fleet could last, and he did not know how long the lunatics of the Imperial Expeditionary Force would attack without caring about their own lives. Did they not know to admit defeat? The Major General's expression was determined as he stared at the metal gap above the base. He looked at the black mecha bathed in the setting sun and thought to himself, if he hadn't been here, if he hadn't kept the morale of the army high, perhaps this base would have been broken through long ago. There were many people who had the same thoughts as the Major General. After the battle, the smoke had yet to disperse. The 300M52 mechas and 10MX mechas started to clean up the battlefield. The staff officers below the base started to assess the damage. The engineering mechas started to hum as they repaired the metal base. The medics focused on sticking the wounds of the injured soldiers on the medical table. However, all of these people would occasionally raise their heads to look at the gap in the setting sun. The eyes of the Federation soldiers were filled with shock, admiration, fanaticism, and so on. The dense missile attack from the Imperial Expeditionary Force had blown up a gap in the northwest corner of the base. The mechas from the Black Sang Alliance were like a black dragon, roaring as they tried to charge in through the gap. The sound of metal colliding with the ground was so clear that it was shocking. Right at the most dangerous moment, the arrogant black mecha that was painted full of golden stars led its mecha battalion to the gap. The moment it arrived, it stood there, not willing to retreat even an inch of ground. It was like a steel wall that couldn't be moved by the wind or broken by the waves. The black mecha that seemed to have some kind of magical power attacked, dodged, and shot crazily. It was so strong that it actually blocked the Empire's mecha group. Every time an Empire mecha was destroyed and an Empire pilot was killed, a shining golden star could be painted on one's mecha. If an Empire mecha was completely destroyed but the Empire pilot in the cockpit survived, then the outer line of the golden star would have to be a virtual line. This was an unspoken but extremely powerful habit of the Federal Army of the 37th Constitutional Era. In the countless smoke-filled front lines of the West Woods, proud mecha warriors could often be seen bathing in the sun, showing off the eye-catching golden stars on their mecha. This was a very direct display of battle results. The more golden stars on a mecha, the more battle achievements the owner of the mecha had. Most of the Federation pilots would think of ways to cover up the golden stars on the surface of their mecha when they were on a real battlefield. This was because the more golden stars on a mecha, the more Empire pilots they had killed. When the Empire soldiers saw these mecha with many golden stars on the battlefield, it was as if they had seen their nemesis who had killed their father, stolen their wife, and white face. They would have a desperate urge to kill no matter the cost. The Federation pilots would not be afraid, but they also did not want to be confused and wrongly killed by an absolutely wasteful missile attack from the Empire because of pride. In the past 20 years, there were not many mechas who dared to step onto the battlefield with a body full of stars, arrogance, and disdain for the Empire's fiery gazes and focused attacks. This was like a completely naked young girl rushing into a military camp that had not seen a sow for 3 years. It was too dangerous, so dangerous that there was a terrifying possibility of being ravaged at any time. It was rumored that a certain commander surnamed Tion from the Special Mecha Brigade of the Westwoods military region was such an awesome person, and he was the only one who could survive the battlefield in such a flashy manner. And now there was another person who dared to stand in the twilight with golden stars all over his body, coldly looking at the Empire mecha without retreating even half a step. Because he was the grandson of the god of war, he was Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. Because he was the young madman who was said to be invincible in the military in a dark corner of the base, the cockpit of the heavy black mecha slowly opened with the sound of jets. Li Feng jumped down and heavily patted the thick and cold mechanical legs of the mecha. He did not even look at the 3 exclusive mechanics who surrounded him and walked into the temporary base with a dark face. The black mecha behind him was painted with golden stars all over its body, like blooming flowers. It was still very eye-catching in the dark, and for a moment, It was impossible to count how many golden stars there were. Uncle Zhong, I'm a soldier. My mission is to fight at the front lines. Li Feng's body was tall and sturdy like a big tree. His handsome face had a hint of childishness, but there was more arrogance between his eyebrows. He frowned and said into the communicator, I'll be careful of my own safety, but I can't leave Qilin. The war in Qilin was very dangerous. Although he was the strongest warrior on the front lines of the West Woods in recent years, he also had a well-known identity. That identity gave him the right to maintain a secret connection with the highest commander on the front lines of the Space Fleet as a battalion commander of a mecha battalion. However, this identity also made this mecha prodigy feel a little suffocated, because none of his direct superiors dared to put him at the front lines, the most dangerous place, to let the only grandson of the god of war die in his own army, and possibly let the Lees of Philadelphia die without descendants. Who dared to bear this responsibility and the anger of hundreds of millions of people in the Federation? Only Commander Zhong, the true tiger of the West Woods, dared to use Madman Li. However, even he, after personally witnessing the fierce battle on the planet's surface, seeing the scene of Madman Li's mecha almost being annihilated by the crazed mecha of the Empire, also had the thought of transferring him back to space. Turning off the communicator, Li Feng pressed his thin, rosy lips together, wanting to laugh but habitually remaining silent and cold. Only Commander Zhong dared to use him under great pressure, daring to send him to a truly dangerous frontline. He was very clear on this point, so he was very grateful to this uncle who took care of him and watched over his youth on the battlefield. Ever since he was sent to the front lines by the old man when he was 12 years old, he had always lived in the Zhong family's mansion at number 36 Latitude 2 District. From a certain perspective, he was single-handedly trained by that tiger of the Zhong family. However, this was something that even his biological father, who was the dean of number 1 hospital, might not have a deep understanding of. In the Qilin landing base, which covered an area of 7 square kilometers, the most important thing was the large transport ship landing platform. The Federation soldiers on the base were bathed in blood as they faced the attacks of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. They didn't even have the time to close their eyes, so naturally, they didn't care about any basic necessities. However, Madman Li was special after all. He had his own room and a bathroom with recycled water. Letting the cold underground water wash his tired body, Li Feng lowered his head and leaned against the wall, his body slightly trembling. After so many consecutive days of extreme fighting, his iron-like body felt that it was reaching its limit. In the water, the muscles on the young Lieutenant Colonel's strong body were well defined. Every muscle seemed to contain an inhuman explosive power, which looked extremely exaggerated. Compared to his body, his head seemed a bit small. After taking a shower, he looked at the time and confirmed that there were still 20 minutes left. Without hesitation, he took out his own pressure box, connected it to the power source, and stuck the electrode to his naked skin. The electric current flowed into the young man's body. He let out a muffled groan. Sweat poured down like a waterfall. The endless pain stimulated the thick veins and blood vessels to the point that they were about to drill out of the copper paper-like skin. Every muscle in his body began to be passively squeezed and rubbed. The pain and soreness followed a certain path and continued to extend. Since he was very young, Madman Li had been practicing like this. If he didn't have the willpower to endure the rare pain in this world, how could he obtain the rare power in this world? How could he paint his mecha with dazzling golden stars? He was like this, and so was Sulu. Those with great willpower were bound to achieve great things. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.